Some people enter your life like a coincidence. Others arrive like a collision, and you never quite recover from the impact. One rainy afternoon in Seattle, a city maintenance worker named Derek Holloway chased a runaway wheelchair down a flooded hill and pulled a stranger back from the edge. He didn't know her name. He didn't know she was worth $300 million, or that she hadn't left her estate in 14 months, or that the simple act of him catching her would unravel both their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. He just saw someone falling, and he ran. If this story moves you, hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The rain had been coming down since noon, not the light, almost apologetic drizzle that Seattle usually offered in November, the kind that locals barely noticed and tourists complained about endlessly. This was different. This was a wall of water that turned gutters into rivers and made the streets look like the city was slowly sinking. Visibility on the upper residential roads had dropped to maybe 40 feet, and the wind kept shifting, unpredictable, knocking road cones over and rattling the yellow caution tape Derek had spent the last 20 minutes trying to string across the storm drain on Linden Avenue. Derek Holloway was 32 years old and built like someone who had done physical work his entire adult life. Broad shoulders, calloused hands, a face that had a few more lines on it than a man his age should probably have. He wore the standard-issue city maintenance jacket, olive green with the Seattle Public Works patch on the left arm, and it was soaked through completely despite the hood being up. He'd given up trying to stay dry around 2 in the afternoon. His radio crackled from the clip on his collar. "Holloway, you still on Linden?" He pressed the button with one wet thumb. "Yeah, drain's starting to back up. I'm going to need some sandbags up here if this keeps going." "Copy that. Dispatch says maybe 40 minutes. 40 minutes. He looked at the water already pooling at the base of the curb. Great. He let go of the radio and went back to the tape. The wind came again and nearly ripped it from his hands, and he swore under his breath and fought it back into place, looping it around the metal barrier post with more force than was probably necessary. His fingers were numb. He should have brought the heavier gloves. He knew that when he left the truck, but Emma had texted him at 6:30 that morning asking him not to forget her school form on the kitchen table, and he'd been so focused on not forgetting that he'd walked out without half of his own gear. He thought about her constantly like that. Small, constant checks, like a background program running that never fully closed. Is she okay? Did she eat? Did she bring her jacket today? Emma was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her own particular brand of stubbornness that Derek had long since stopped trying to argue with. She was with Mrs. Caldera from downstairs until he got home, same as most weekdays, and she'd probably already charmed the woman into making hot chocolate and letting her watch something she wasn't technically supposed to watch. Emma had a gift for that. For making people feel like doing nice things for her was entirely their own idea. He missed her, even now, even just 7 hours into the workday. That was the part nobody warned you about when you became the only parent. The missing didn't turn off. He was still thinking about her when he heard it. At first he thought it was just the wind doing something weird, carrying a sound from further down the hill, reshaping it into something it wasn't. But then he heard it again, and this time he turned around. A wheelchair was coming down the middle of Crest Haven Road. It wasn't moving slowly. The hill on Crest Haven dropped steeply toward the intersection below, and whatever had sent the chair rolling had sent it with real momentum. The rain was making the asphalt slick and reflective, and the chair was moving fast enough that the wheels were throwing small fans of water up on both sides. There was a woman in it. She wasn't screaming. That was the thing that caught him. She wasn't screaming, wasn't throwing her arms out, wasn't doing any of the things a person does when they're terrified. She was gripping both armrests, and her jaw was set, and her eyes were fixed straight ahead, like she was calculating something, like she was still trying to solve this rather than just survive it. Derek dropped the tape and ran. He wasn't a fast runner. He was a big man, and running wasn't really his thing. But he ran hard, and Crest Haven was close, and the angle worked in his favor because he was coming at the chair from the side rather than chasing it. He hit the intersection at almost the same moment the chair did, and he got both hands on the push handles from behind and dug his heels in, and it wasn't graceful at all. He nearly went down, one knee dropping almost to the pavement, his boots scraping hard against the asphalt as the momentum tried to take them both into the crossing. But he held. They stopped maybe 6 feet from the curb. He stayed bent over the chair for a moment, breathing hard, rain hammering the back of his neck. His knee hurt where it had scraped. His hands were shaking slightly, though he chose to attribute that to the cold. The woman in the chair hadn't made a sound through any of it. He straightened up slowly and moved around to face her, because it felt wrong to have a conversation with the back of someone's head. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, though something in her face had the quality of a person who had been through things that aged you in ways that had nothing to do with time. She was pale, not sick pale, just genuinely light-complexioned in the way of someone who didn't spend much time outdoors. Dark hair, wet now, and plastered against the side of her face. She wore a dark coat that looked expensive even soaked through, and her hands were still wrapped around the armrests of the chair with a grip that hadn't fully released yet. She looked at him the way people look at each other after near accidents, that brief, strange period where you're both still processing that the worst didn't happen. "You all right?" he asked. She took a breath. "Yes." Her voice was even, controlled, like she'd decided, somewhere on the way down that hill, that she was going to be all right regardless of how it ended, and the fact that it had ended with him catching her instead of the intersection was simply new information she was updating her position with. "The brake," she said. "The rear brake cable. It snapped. I didn't—" She paused. "I noticed it too late." "How far did you come from?" She tilted her head slightly, and for the first time something shifted in her expression. Not quite embarrassment, but close. "The estate, at the top of Cresthaven. I came out for air." She said it like she was slightly annoyed at herself for the admission. "I don't usually—" She stopped, started again. "I misjudged the weather." Derek looked up the hill. The Ashford estate was up there. He knew it by sight the way anyone who worked city maintenance in that district knew it. A massive stone and glass property sitting behind iron gates at the top of the ridge, probably 12,000 square feet, immaculately maintained from the outside. You saw the grounds crew up there sometimes. You never saw anyone actually living in it. He looked back at her. She was watching him figure it out, and she knew he was figuring it out, and neither of them said anything about it for a moment. "I need to check the back wheel," he said finally, keeping his voice practical. "If the brake cable snapped clean, the mount might have cracked too. I don't want to push you anywhere until I know that wheel's stable." Something in her expression shifted, a slight softening, though she controlled it quickly. "All right." He crouched behind the chair and examined the rear mechanism with the small flashlight from his jacket pocket. The cable had snapped clean, the frayed ends still sharp. The mount was intact, good, solid steel, no crack. The wheel itself was fine. He straightened up. "Wheel's okay. The cable's the problem. You can't use the brake until it's replaced, which means going uphill is—" He glanced back up Cresthaven. In this rain, pushing that chair up that gradient without functioning brakes on both sides wasn't something he was willing to do. "It's not a good idea right now." She looked up the hill too, said nothing. "I've got a truck," Derek said. 2 blocks over. I can get you home." She turned back to him. Her eyes were dark gray, which he hadn't noticed initially, and there was something careful in them, an assessment that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't open either, like she was used to people offering things that came with conditions attached. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I know I don't need to." He wasn't sure why he said it quite that way, but it came out matter-of-fact rather than generous. "But your brake cables snapped in the middle of a storm, so—" Another pause. The rain kept coming. She reached into the pocket of her coat. Her hand came back with a set of keys, silver, on a simple ring, and she held them out to him. Her grip was steady. "The gate code is 7741, she said. "If you pull to the side entrance, there's a ramp." He took the keys. They were cold from her pocket, but she'd been holding them for a while. The metal had picked up just a little warmth from her hand. "I'm Derek," he said. "Holloway." A beat. "Victoria," she said. "Ashford." He nodded, like he wasn't entirely sure what to do with that, tucked the keys in his jacket pocket, and went to get his truck. The side entrance to Ashford Estate was exactly where she'd said it was. a gated drive off the lower end of the property that opened onto a covered carport and a wide concrete ramp leading to the side door. Derek had loaded the chair into the truck bed and helped her into the passenger seat with a minimum of conversation, and she'd accepted the help without making it into something difficult, which he'd been quietly grateful for. He had spent enough time on job sites to have encountered people who turned every offer of assistance into a negotiation, and this wasn't that. She directed him with brief, clear instructions. Left at the stone marker, through the iron gate, codes on the keypad. The gate opens slow, so give it time. He followed them. The truck felt slightly ridiculous on the estate driveway, a city maintenance vehicle with a dented rear quarter panel and a cracked side mirror sitting between hedgerows that had probably been shaped by professionals. When he got the chair back out and assembled and helped her settle back into it, a process she clearly had her own system for, and he tried to assist without getting in the way of it, she turned at the door. "Thank you," she said. Then, after a pause, "You're with the city. Maintenance." "That's right." "Do you work this district regularly?" "Yeah. Upper residential, mostly drainage and road upkeep, some structural." She looked at him for a moment. There was something calculating in it, but not cold, more like she was working something out. "The east wing of the property," she said. "Some of the accessible pathways there are problems. They've been problems for a while." She stopped. "Would you be available on a private contract basis, separate from city work?" Derek looked at her. The rain was still coming down and he was still wet, and it had been a long day. "What kind of problems?" "Grading issues, one ramp that's no longer ADA compliant, a section of path that's cracked badly enough that the chair gets stuck in it." She said it evenly, but there was something underneath the evenness, a small, controlled admission. "I've had difficulty getting contractors to prioritize it." He thought about that. Thought about the mortgage payment that was currently 11 days from being a problem. Thought about Emma's school trip that he hadn't said yes to yet because the form also asked for a $60 contribution. "I could come take a look," he said. "This weekend, if you want." "Saturday," she said. 8 in the morning." 8 it is. She gave him a single nod and turned her chair toward the door, and he walked back to his truck thinking that the whole thing had happened very fast, and also that she had the air of someone who made decisions quickly and didn't revisit them, which was a personality type he'd had limited experience with. He drove back to Linden Avenue. The sandbags had arrived while he was gone, his partner Tomas already placing them without complaint, though he gave Derek a look that asked about 4 different questions. "Lady in a wheelchair," Derek said before Tomas could ask any of them. "Runaway chair on Cresthaven. I gave her a lift back." Tomas considered this. "Okay." "She lives in the Ashford estate." Tomas's expression changed slightly. "That Ashford estate? The big one at the top?" "Yeah." "Huh." Thomas handed him the sandbag and they got back to work, and neither of them said anything else about it, and Derek didn't mention the Saturday appointment because something told him that if he mentioned it, it would become a bigger thing than it needed to be right now. He picked Emma up from Mrs. Caldera's apartment at 6:15, and she was wearing a blanket like a cape and had chocolate on her chin and was in the middle of explaining something complicated about her day to Mrs. Caldera, who was listening with the patient attention of a woman who genuinely liked children and also had excellent hearing aids. "Dad," Emma launched herself at him with the complete physical confidence of a 7-year-old who had never once doubted she'd be caught. He caught her, which he always did, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and her legs around his waist and informed him that she had made a new friend at school whose name was possibly Zoe or possibly Chloe, and she hadn't been sure enough to ask a second time. "Smart strategy," he said. "Mrs. Caldera says I can come back tomorrow if you have to work late again." "I might not have to." Emma pulled back and looked at him with the dark, serious eyes she had inherited from her mother, slightly narrowed in assessment. "You look wet. It was raining. You look really wet." "I ran through some of it." She accepted this without further interrogation, which meant she was saving her questions for later, which was somehow worse. They said goodnight to Mrs. Caldera and took the elevator up 2 floors to their apartment, which was warm and not very large, and had Emma's drawings covering a significant portion of the refrigerator. He made pasta because it was fast, and she sat on the kitchen counter the way she always did when she was supposed to be doing homework at the table, and she told him about the science project and about a boy in her class who ate his eraser, and about the fact that Mrs. Patterson had gotten a new haircut that nobody liked but everyone pretended to. "Do you think it's nicer to pretend you like something when you don't?" she asked, with the tone of someone who had been genuinely wrestling with this. Derek thought about it properly before answering. "Depends on whether it matters," he said. "For a haircut that's already done and she can't change, yeah, probably. For something she could actually fix, maybe not." Emma considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's pretty complicated." "Most things are." She helped him clear the table without being asked, which she did sometimes and didn't other times, seemingly at random, and he'd long since stopped trying to identify the pattern. After dinner, she did her homework at the actual table, while he went over the week's bills and tried to figure out what the contractor work for Ashford Estate might be worth if the ramp alone needed full rebuilding. He'd done enough side jobs over the years to have a rough number. Materials plus labor, plus the fact that whoever had quoted it before clearly hadn't been interested. The kind of work that got deprioritized because accessible pathways didn't get complained about loudly enough or often enough to make it worth the trouble. People like Victoria Ashford got told things would be handled, and then nothing happened. He wrote a rough estimate on the back of an envelope. Then he put it in his jacket pocket and tried not to think about it too much because he'd learned over the years that getting too attached to numbers before a job was confirmed was its own kind of mistake. Emma was asleep by 8:30, door halfway open the way she liked it, one lamp on in the hallway. He sat in the living room for a while after, not watching the TV that was on in the background, thinking about the day. He thought about the moment he'd seen the chair moving, the specific quality of having noticed it just in time, and how differently the afternoon could have ended if he'd been 50 feet further away, or facing the other direction, or just 2 minutes later finishing the drain tape. He thought about her face when he'd come around the front of the chair, the way she'd already composed herself, already building the wall back up. Not cold, just protected. The way you got after you'd been hurt enough times that keeping yourself even had become the primary skill. He knew something about that. Saturday arrived gray and cold but without rain, which Derek considered a reasonable trade. He pulled up to the Ashford Estate at 7:58, which was close enough to 8 that it didn't seem anxious, and waited at the gate until it occurred to him that he had the keypad code. 7741. The gate swung open, slow like she'd said. A man met him at the carport, mid-60s, solid, with the composed manner of someone who had worked in private households for a long time. He introduced himself as Gerald, the estate's house manager, and walked Derek to where Victoria was already waiting near the start of the East Wing pathway. She was in a different chair today. An everyday chair, less sleek than the one from the street, more worn at the armrests. She wore a gray sweater and her hair was down and she had a coffee mug cradled in her lap. And she was looking at a section of path with the expression of someone reviewing a problem they had been looking at for too long. "Mr. Holloway," she said when she saw him. Not Derek. He noted that but didn't push on it. "Morning." He looked at the section of path she was looking at. "That it?" "That and the east ramp. And there's a transition threshold at the side entrance that's become an issue." He crouched down and looked at the path crack. It ran diagonally about 4 feet, wide enough at the center that a standard wheelchair wheel would catch it. "When did this start?" "The winter before last. It's been getting worse." "Freeze thaw. The base layer wasn't laid deep enough. You patch this surface, and it'll just crack again." He stood. "Needs to be cut and repoured properly. Do you have access to the original construction documents?" She looked at him like that was a question she hadn't expected. "Possibly. Gerald might know? It helps. If the base was done wrong the first time, I want to know what we're dealing with before I dig." Gerald, who had followed them out and was standing slightly to the side with the patient attentiveness of his role, said he would check the estate records. They spent 45 minutes walking, or in Victoria's case, rolling, the full east wing. Derek took notes on his phone. The ramp angle was wrong, currently at a 10-degree pitch when the maximum was supposed to be roughly 4.8. The transition at the side entrance had a 1-inch lip that had probably been fine originally and had risen as the slab settled. 2 areas of path where the drainage slope pushed water across the surface instead of away from it, which would ice over in winter and create a hazard that was currently just an inconvenience, but was an incident waiting to happen. Victoria watched him work and didn't interrupt, which he appreciated. He'd had clients who talked constantly when he was trying to assess, and it made it very hard to do the assessment. When they were finished, she asked him what he thought. 4 to 6 weeks for everything, depending on weather and material availability, he said. The ramp is the most involved. I'll need to pour new footings. The path repair is straightforward, but needs to cure properly. Can't rush it. The threshold is probably a day's work. She nodded. How much? He gave her the number he'd written on the envelope. She didn't flinch, which told him either the number was right or she wasn't the kind of person who showed things like that on her face. Probably some of both. When can you start? I need to pull the city's materials list, see what I can source. Next Saturday, maybe. Realistically, the Saturday after. 2 weeks. She considered this. All right. She started to turn her chair back toward the house, then stopped. You'll need access to the grounds when you're working. Gerald will give you a key code for the worker's entrance. A pause. You can bring your daughter if she needs to come. Gerald can arrange something for her while you're working. He hadn't mentioned Emma. He hadn't said anything about Emma. She must have seen the question on his face because something almost like amusement crossed hers. Gerald checked your city records before I confirmed this morning. Basic due diligence. Right. He processed that. She's okay on job sites. She doesn't get into things. I didn't assume she would. She started turning toward the house again. 2 weeks then. He watched her go, then looked back at the cracked path. The crack was obvious now that he was looking at it properly. He couldn't understand why it had been left this long. But that was the thing about problems that were yours alone to deal with. Sometimes you looked at them so often that you stopped seeing them. The 2 weeks passed the way weeks did. In the accumulation of small things, most of them unremarkable. Derek worked his city shifts, picked Emma up, made dinner, dealt with the water pressure problem in the bathroom that had been a low-grade irritation for 3 months, helped Emma build a cardboard replica of a volcano for a class project that she had decided should also have a working door, which she was firm about and which presented certain structural challenges. He thought about the estate sometimes, thought about Victoria Ashford, and the specific quality of someone who had clearly once occupied a very large life and had, for reasons he didn't yet know, compressed herself down to something much smaller and tried to make it work. He knew what that looked like. He'd done a version of it himself after Claire died. The narrowing. The way you reduced your surface area so there was less of you for the world to hit. He'd found his way to a kind of stability since then, but it was a careful stability, the kind that required maintenance. He worked. He was there for Emma. He kept the parts of himself that were capable of falling apart reasonably contained. That was the deal he'd made with himself at 30 years old at a graveside in the rain, and it had held, more or less, for the last 3 years. The first Saturday at Ashford Estate, he brought Emma. She sat in the carport for approximately 7 minutes before she got up and started walking around, examining things with the focused curiosity she brought to most new environments. Gerald had set up a small table with a drawing kit and a glass of juice, which Emma acknowledged politely and then largely ignored in favor of finding a large smooth stone near the garden wall that she decided was the most interesting thing on the property. Derek was setting up the saw for the path cut when he heard footsteps, or rather the quiet rolling sound of wheels on stone, and looked up to find Victoria at the edge of the work area. She was looking at Emma, who was crouched over the stone with the expression of a geologist who had just made a significant discovery. She found the garnet stone, Victoria said. It's been there for 30 years. My father put it there. Sorry if she's not bothering anything. Victoria watched Emma for a moment. She's careful with it. She's careful with things she finds interesting. A pause. Most children aren't. She's different. He said it simply, without the self-consciousness of a parent trying to convince someone. And maybe that was why Victoria didn't seem to feel the need to respond with a diplomatic agreement. Instead, she said, "The construction documents were in the estate's original filing. Gerald left them in the work shed for you." I saw them. Thanks. They're helpful. The base layer was poured at 6 inches instead of 8. That's why it's cracking. The contractor said at the time that 6 was sufficient. For this climate, with this freeze-thaw cycle, it wasn't. He said it without inflection. It wasn't an accusation of anyone currently present, just a fact. She nodded once. A short silence, not uncomfortable. "I'll let you work," she said. She turned back toward the house, and at that moment Emma looked up from the garnet stone and said, brightly and without preamble, "Is that your house?" Victoria stopped. He braced himself slightly, because Emma's directness was not always calibrated to the social register of the person she was addressing it at. But Victoria turned and she looked at Emma with an expression that was careful and a little complicated, and she said, "Yes, it is." "It's really big," Emma said. "Do you ever get lost in it?" Something shifted in Victoria's face. It was small, the kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. "Sometimes," she said. Emma nodded seriously, like that confirmed something. "I would probably get lost in it too," she said, in the tone of one person acknowledging a mutual vulnerability to another. Then she went back to the stone. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and went back toward the house. And Derek watched her go. And he didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. He went back to marking the cut lines on the path. By noon he had the section opened up and was mixing the base pour, and Emma had wandered to the garden wall and back twice, and had eaten the lunch Mrs. Caldera had packed for her, and had drawn a picture of the garnet stone that she presented to him with some ceremony and then decided was not finished and took back. At 12:30, Gerald appeared with a plate of sandwiches and 2 glasses of iced tea, which he set on the work table without commentary and retreated with the same composed efficiency with which he did everything. Derek looked at the sandwiches. They were cut diagonally, which somehow felt like a detail. He ate one and didn't say anything to anyone about it. The second Saturday brought rain, not the wall of water from that first afternoon, but a steady, cool drizzle that made working outside manageable with the right gear. Derek had the ramp footings to pour, which required him to be down on his knees in the wet ground for most of the morning, and he was doing exactly that when he heard Emma say, from somewhere behind him, "What happened to your legs?" He came very close to dropping the leveling tool. He stood and turned. Emma was standing near the estate's side door, looking up at Victoria with the same open directness she brought to every question she considered important, and Victoria had stopped in the doorway. "Emma," he started. "It's all right," Victoria said. She looked at Emma without irritation. "I was in an accident," she said, "about 1.5 years ago. Did it hurt?" "Yes." "Does it still hurt?" A pause. "Not the same way it did, but sometimes, yes." Emma thought about this. "I fell off the slide at the park last year and hurt my elbow. It was really bad for a while, but then it got better." "That's usually how it goes," Victoria said. "I hope yours gets better more," Emma said, with the earnest practicality of someone who understood that wishing something was not the same as it happening, but who also felt the wish was worth stating. Victoria looked at her for a moment. Her expression had that complicated quality again, like she was managing something. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was very quiet. Emma nodded and went back to whatever she was drawing on the wall of the carport with a piece of chalk that had appeared from somewhere, and Victoria sat at the doorway for a few minutes before she went back inside, and Derek went back to the footings and concentrated very hard on getting the level exactly right. By the 4th Saturday, something had shifted in the rhythm of the days. Victoria had started appearing in the late morning, not to observe the work, or at least not obviously, but to be near the outdoor space in a way that felt like someone testing how much they could bear of the open air. She would sit with a laptop or a folder of papers and work in the covered part of the carport, and Derek would work on the east path, and Emma would draw or explore or conduct complicated experiments with water from the garden hose that she described as science, and Derek described as wet. They didn't talk much during these mornings, not directly, but things were said. Emma said a lot of them, without apparent awareness that she was functioning as a social bridge, asking Victoria about the stone, and about the house, and about whether she had a dog, and upon learning that she didn't, whether she had considered a dog, and upon hearing that she hadn't particularly, explaining at some length the advantages of dogs generally, and small dogs specifically. "Do you want a dog?" Derek asked Emma later, on the drive home. "A little bit," Emma said, "but we don't have room." "That's very reasonable." "I know." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window at the passing street, her profile clean and exact, her mother's jaw and her mother's lashes. I like her, Emma said suddenly. He didn't need to ask who. Yeah? She's sad, Emma said, but not the same kind of sad as before. Like she's trying not to be sad. That's different. He kept his eyes on the road. That's pretty perceptive, Em. Mrs. Caldera says I'm perceptive. Mrs. Caldera's right. Emma turned back to the window. Do you think she has friends? She asked. Like actual friends who come over? He thought about the estate as he'd seen it across 4 Saturdays now. The absence of cars in the drive. The way Gerald seemed to be the only other person there consistently. The way Victoria worked from inside what was essentially a very elegant and very expensive isolation. I don't know, he said. She should have friends, Emma said, with the certainty of someone for whom this was simple. Everybody should have friends. He drove the rest of the way home without answering because Emma was right, and there was nothing useful to add to that. The path was finished on a Wednesday afternoon. He'd gotten permission from his supervisor to use some personal hours and come up to complete the final pour before the weather window closed. He was sealing the edges when Victoria came out, not in her usual composed way but moving faster, her chair pushing through the gap in the side door with slightly more force than usual. The board, she said, and then stopped, like she'd started the sentence before she'd decided whether to finish it. What about them? She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were in her lap, and they weren't loose. They were pressed flat against her thighs the way hands press when you're making yourself hold still. They've been monitoring, she said. The estate entrance, the work schedule. A pause. Someone ran the city records for your employment history. She said it with a specific flatness that told him this wasn't entirely a surprise to her, but that it had still landed badly. My assistant called this morning to warn me before someone else did. He straightened up, looked at her. Okay. It's not personal. She said it like she was explaining something to herself as much as to him. They have concerns about optics, a CEO who's been out of public view, and the maintenance worker who's been... She stopped. Coming here. He was quiet for a moment. Coming here and fixing the paths you need to use, he said. That's not how they're framing it. I know. She looked at the finished path. The new section was slightly lighter in color than the surrounding concrete, bright and even, the edges clean. She was quiet for a long moment. I want to be clear, she said. Whatever they're... She stopped again, started again. This is my property. This is my decision. I have no intention of... Victoria. He said her name for the first time and she stopped talking. You don't have to explain yourself to me. She looked at him. Something in her face had that quality again. The one he'd first seen at the bottom of Cresthaven Road. Like she was recalibrating. No, she said finally. I know I don't. He went back to sealing the edges. She sat there for a while longer, in the quiet of the nearly finished path, and neither of them said anything else, and the afternoon light came down through the cloud break and lit the wet concrete in a way that made it look almost like water. He finished just as the light faded, packed his tools into the truck, and drove down the estate driveway for what he didn't know yet would be the last Saturday for a while. He didn't know that because she hadn't told him yet. That part was coming. The call came on a Tuesday. Derek was eating lunch in the truck cab, engine running for heat, parked half a block from a sinkhole repair on Meridian Avenue that his crew had been working since 7 in the morning. He had a thermos of coffee and a sandwich Emma had helped make the night before, which she'd insisted on cutting into a triangle because she'd read somewhere that triangles tasted better. He told her that was not scientifically supported. She'd told him she was doing an experiment. He'd let it go. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. Unknown number, but a local area code. Holloway, Sauta, he answered. Mr. Holloway. The voice was formal, clipped, professional in the way that cost money. My name is Richard Farley. I'm the executive liaison for Ashford Industries. Derek set down the sandwich. Okay. I'm calling on behalf of the board to address the private contract work you've been performing at the Ashford estate. A pause that was carefully timed to feel significant. The board has concerns about the nature of this arrangement and its potential visibility in the press. It's path repair and ramp work, Derek said. A DA compliance upgrades. We understand what the work is, Mr. Holloway. Then I'm not sure what the concern is. Another pause. Less carefully timed this time, which told him Farley had expected more resistance or less of it, and he'd given him something in between that didn't fit the script. Ms. Ashford's public profile is a sensitive matter. The board is responsible for managing the company's reputation, which includes the personal associations of its CEO. Derek was quiet for a moment, watching the rain start again on the windshield. So you're calling to tell me to stop coming to the estate? We're calling to make you aware of the situation. You're calling to tell me to stop. A pause. We feel it would be in everyone's interest. Does Ms. Ashford know you're making this call? The pause this time was longer. The board acts in the company's best interests, which was not an answer. Derek noted that. I've got a contract for the remaining work, he said, a ramp installation and a threshold repair. Materials are already ordered. The board is prepared to compensate you for materials and a reasonable cancellation fee. He stared at the sinkhole through the windshield. The crew was pulling up asphalt in sheets, the broken edges rough and dark. I'll need to hear from Ms. Ashford directly, he said. A pause that had a different quality than the others, colder and less patient. That may not be necessary. It's necessary for me. He hung up and sat with the half-eaten sandwich for a while. Then he texted Victoria, not to the number he'd been given by Gerald for scheduling, but to the number she'd sent him herself 2 weeks ago when there'd been a question about the footing dimensions. A short text. Got a call from Richard Farley. Can we talk? He waited 3 hours for a response. It came while he was hosing down equipment at the end of shift. I know. I'm handling it. I'll call you tonight. She didn't call that night, or the next morning. On Thursday, Gerald called instead, and he was professional and genuinely apologetic in a way that suggested the apology was real and not just procedural. And he told Derek that Ms. Ashford wanted him to know the project would be put on hold for the time being, and that the cancellation compensation Richard Farley had mentioned would be sent by end of week. Is she okay? Derek asked before he could stop himself. A pause. She's managing, Gerald said carefully. Right. He pressed the heel of his hand against the side of the truck. Okay. Tell her I hope the threshold gets fixed eventually. It's a fall risk. I'll pass that along, Mr. Holloway. He stood in the parking lot of the city maintenance yard for a while after the call ended, not moving, the phone still in his hand. The evening was gray and cold and smelled like asphalt and rain, which was just the smell of this city, the smell he'd grown up with, but it felt sharper than usual. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. He'd known who she was, or who she was in the world's terms, the board's terms, the terms printed in business sections and quarterly reports. He'd known that from the start. The fact that she'd let him come to the estate 4 Saturdays in a row, that she'd sat in the carport and worked while Emma did her complicated water experiments near the garden wall, that she'd asked Emma questions about her drawings with what seemed like genuine attention. None of that had changed what was true about the distance between their lives. He drove home. He made dinner. Emma told him about a disagreement with a classmate that she described as complex, and he described internally as standard second-grade social friction. They did homework and watched half a movie, and she fell asleep before it ended, one hand tucked under her cheek, and he carried her to her room and tucked the blanket around her the way she liked, with the edge folded down because she said otherwise it was too tight. He sat in the living room afterward with the TV off, which was unusual, and just sat with it for a while. The quiet, the specific shape of things that hadn't happened and were now not going to. Then he got up, washed the dishes, and went to bed. 3 days later, a check arrived in the mail. The amount was correct. Materials plus labor for the remaining work, plus a cancellation figure that was, frankly, more than he'd have asked for. The check was from Ashford Industries accounts payable, not from Victoria. He held it for a long time before depositing it. Life reassembled itself around the absence of Saturdays at the estate the way life always did around absences, filling in the space with other things, other routines, other small obligations that didn't feel meaningful but took up time, which was the point. Derek picked up an extra city shift on Saturdays. He took Emma to the Science Museum, which she'd been asking about for weeks. and she stood in front of the earthquake simulation exhibit for 20 minutes with a focused expression that suggested she was memorizing it. He fixed the water pressure problem in the bathroom, finally, which turned out to be a corroded valve that had been slowly narrowing for 2 years and just needed replacing. He was good at that, he knew. At finding the corroded valve, at understanding what was structural and what was cosmetic, and what had been fine once but had quietly degraded over time. He just didn't always know what to do with that when the thing in question wasn't a pipe. November turned to December. The city put up lights along the main commercial corridor, the kind of municipal decorating that managed to be cheerful and perfunctory at the same time, and Emma started adding very specific items to what she called her thinking list for the winter break. Not a list for any particular occasion, just things she was thinking about wanting. Derek appreciated the philosophical framing. He was running a load of drainage pipe along the waterfront on a Wednesday morning, about 3 weeks after the Farley call, when Tomas fell into step beside him on the way back to the truck. "Hey," Tomas said. "Hey." So, Tomas had a specific quality of hesitation that preceded things he'd been thinking about for a while and had finally decided to say. "The Ashford thing. What about it?" "I heard you got cut loose." Derek glanced at him. "Word travels." "Martinez heard it from dispatch. Dispatch heard it from somebody in permits." Tomas shrugged. "You know how it goes. Bureaucracy is just gossip with paperwork. That's actually pretty good." Tomas was quiet for a beat. "You okay about it?" "It was a contract job that got canceled. Happens." "Right." Another beat. "It's just, you seemed different on those Saturdays. Easier somehow, I noticed." Derek kept walking. "Different isn't always the same as better." "No," Tomas agreed, "but it's usually significant." Derek didn't answer that, and Tomas let it go, because Tomas was good at knowing when to let things go, which was most of why they'd worked together for 3 years without any real friction. But he thought about it. Easier. He wasn't sure that was the right word. He'd been more engaged, maybe, more present. The work on the estate had required him to actually think about grades and load tolerances and base materials and what would hold versus what would look fine for 2 seasons and then start failing. It was the kind of problem that used a part of his brain that city maintenance didn't always reach. He'd done 2 years of civil engineering at University of Washington before he'd had to leave. Money, then life circumstances, then Claire, then all the other things that had made finishing feel less urgent until one day it was just a thing from before, cataloged alongside other things from before. He didn't think about it much. He told almost nobody. It wasn't relevant, and there was a specific kind of embarrassment in having started something and not finished it that he'd found easier to just not discuss. Victoria hadn't asked about his background. They hadn't gotten to that part. The media hit came on a Thursday morning in the second week of December, and Derek found out about it the way he found out about most things that happened in the world that weren't his direct problem, from Tomas, who had read it on his phone during break. "There's a piece," Tomas said, setting his phone on the hood of the truck between them. "In one of those business social things. You know, the ones that do CEO profiles." Derek looked at the screen. The headline was "Ashford Industries CEO Returns to Public View." After 18-month absence, and the photo beneath it was Victoria at what looked like a corporate event, a nonprofit fundraiser based on the caption, in a dark blazer, her hair up, looking exactly like the person her board wanted people to see. Composed. Authoritative. Back. He read the first few paragraphs. The piece covered her accident in careful, non-specific language, a serious incident that required an extended recovery period, and her return to active leadership of Ashford Industries. There was a quote from the CFO about strong quarterly performance. There was a quote from a board member about her resilience. There was nothing about the estate, nothing about ongoing accessibility work, nothing that even gestured at the months preceding this. He handed the phone back to Tomas. "Good for her," he said, and meant it, and went back to work. But that evening, after Emma was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and let himself think about it properly. Not in a self-pitying way. He'd done enough of that in the year after Claire died to have burned most of that out. Just honestly. He missed being there. He missed the work specifically, the physical satisfaction of building something that worked and would keep working, something with a purpose that was obvious and real. He missed the specific silence of working while Victoria was nearby doing her own work. That particular quality of shared quiet that wasn't the same as being alone. He missed Emma's face the Saturday she'd first made Victoria laugh. He hadn't been watching Victoria, he'd been measuring the ramp pitch, but Emma had said something and he'd heard the sound, and he'd looked over and it was the involuntary kind of laugh, the kind that escapes before you can manage it. And for 1 second, Victoria's face had looked entirely different than it usually did. Younger, less careful. That was the thing about Victoria Ashford, and he was only admitting this to himself in the kitchen at 11 p.m. with the lights low. She was interesting. Not in a surface way, not because of who she was on paper. In the way that someone is interesting when they're clearly more than what they're showing you, and you can see the edges of it but not the center, and you find yourself genuinely curious. He wasn't romanticizing it. He was 32 years old and had a child and a city salary and a bathroom he'd just fixed himself. He knew what the world looked like. He wasn't under any illusions about the territory, but he could be honest about what he missed. That was allowed. He cleared the table, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. Tap. The text arrived at 6:43 on a Saturday morning, which was early even by his standards. He was awake. He was almost always awake by 6, a habit Emma had installed in him that showed no signs of reversing, and the phone buzzed on the nightstand while he was standing in the kitchen waiting for coffee. I owe you an explanation. I know you'll say you don't need one. I'm going to give it to you anyway. V. He stared at it for a moment. Then he typed back. Okay. A pause. Then the messages started coming in, one after another, slightly stilted in the way of someone who had composed this carefully and was now delivering it in pieces. The board found out about the photos. Someone with a long lens on Cresthaven the day you caught the chair. They'd been sitting on it, apparently, deciding whether to use it as leverage. When I didn't respond to Farley the way they expected, distancing myself from you publicly, issuing a statement, they escalated. They threatened to go to the financial press with a narrative about erratic behavior during my recovery. They have enough pull to make that damaging. I have a shareholders meeting in February. I cannot afford a destabilization campaign right now, not with the quarter we've had, and not with the board this fractured. He read each message as it came in, leaning against the counter, coffee growing cold. What I did? Calling the contract off through Gerald without calling you myself, was cowardly. I know that. I told myself it was cleaner. It wasn't. A longer pause. I'm sorry about Emma's time too. She was... A pause. She was the first person in a long time who looked at me like I was just a regular person with a sad situation, not a story or a liability or a symbol. He set the phone down, picked it up again. Is she okay? Victoria had added, and it was so stripped of any performance that it caught him off guard. He typed, She's fine. She keeps asking when we're going back to fix the ramp. 3 dots appeared, held for a moment. Then, the ramp is still not done. I know. Another pause. The threshold too. Gerald trips on it at least once a week. I know that too. I told him it was a fall risk. He told me you said that. The dots appeared again, held. I'm going to be at the estate this weekend, if you wanted to finish the work. It's a paid contract. It doesn't have to be anything else. He thought about that for a moment. Emma was going to be with Mrs. Caldera that Saturday anyway. A birthday thing for one of her school friends that involved a lot of excitement about a pottery studio. He'd have the morning free. He typed, What time? 8. I'll be there. That's Saturday morning was cold and bright, which was unusual for Seattle in December, and the estate looked different in the direct sun. The iron gate caught light at a different angle, the stone exterior lighter somehow, the grounds visible in more detail than the gray November Saturdays had allowed. He punched in the gate code and drove up the carport drive and unloaded his tools with the familiar rhythm of a job he already knew most of, already had the measurements for, already understood the scope of. Gerald came out and shook his hand and said it was good to see him, which Derek believed. She's in the morning room, Gerald said. She'll be out shortly. He started on the threshold first. It was the smaller job and would let him warm up into the work. He was scoring the edges when he heard the wheel sound on the stone behind him, and he turned. She looked different than he'd expected her to, which he recognized as his own error. He'd been carrying a picture of her from 3 weeks ago, and the real version was always going to be a correction. She was wearing a dark green sweater and her hair was loose, and there were lines of tiredness around her eyes that the corporate photo hadn't shown. She looked like someone who had been in a lot of meetings for a long time and was very much done with them. "You came," she said. "You said 8. I was here at 8. You were here at 7:53. He looked at her. "Were you watching the gate?" Something that was almost a smile. "Gerald reports." He turned back to the threshold. "Threshold first, then the ramp. Should be done by noon if the weather holds." She rolled a bit closer and looked at the threshold herself. "It's worse than I remembered." "They always are when you look at them properly." She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her working up to something, and he let her take the time she needed. "I meant what I said in the texts," she said, "about it being cowardly." "I know you did." He kept working. "You don't need to say it again." "I want to say it again." He set the scoring tool down and looked at her. "Victoria, you did what you had to do. I understand that. I don't love how it happened, but I understand why." A pause. "Can we move past it?" She looked at him for a moment. Her jaw had that set quality from the hill, the one that meant she was working something out rather than just reacting. "You're not angry?" "I was a little." He picked up the tool again. "Then I thought about it more. You're running a company with a fractured board 3 months out from a shareholders meeting. You're doing it alone, from an estate you've basically been hiding in, and the last thing you needed was someone to hand the board a weapon." He looked down at the threshold. Getting angry at you for making a practical decision under real pressure didn't seem like the right use of energy. The silence went on for a beat. "Most people would have just been angry," she said. "I'm not most people." "No," she said. "I'm aware." He finished scoring the threshold edges and mixed the leveling compound in the bucket, and she stayed close enough to be present, but not in the way, which was the same balance they'd always had on the workdays. It wasn't something they'd negotiated. It had just evolved into what it was, the way things do when two people are both practical and neither of them needs to fill silence with noise. "The board wants me to do a series of public appearances in January," she said after a while. "Profile pieces, charity board photo opportunities, the whole managed return narrative." "Are you going to?" "Some of them, the ones that are actually useful." She paused. "And 1 or 2 because I don't have leverage to say no yet." "How long until you do?" "February. After the shareholders meeting, if it goes the way I need it to." He nodded, working the compound into the joint. "And if it doesn't?" A short silence. "Let's not do that math right now." "Fair enough." He worked in silence for a while, and she watched the garden wall, where the garnet stone still sat in its spot, and the morning light sat on it in a way that made the small red inclusions in the gray surface glow a little, like something from a distance away was shining into it. "Emma named it," Victoria said suddenly. He looked up. "What?" "The stone. She sent me a drawing in the mail 3 weeks ago. I think Gerald gave her the address. The drawing had Rocky written on it in capital letters." A pause. "With a smiley face." Derek closed his eyes briefly. "She didn't tell me she was going to do that." "No, I imagine she made that decision independently. She does a lot of things independently." I noticed. And this time the almost smile became the real version, brief and involuntary, the same way it had been that Saturday in the carport. And then it was gone again, but not in the managed way, just naturally, the way a smile goes when the moment passes. He finished the threshold by 10. The ramp took until nearly 1, and it wasn't quite noon the way he'd said it would be, because the footing anchor on the right side had set slightly wrong and had to be broken out and re-poured, which added 40 minutes and cost him the knuckle on his right hand when the breaker slipped. He swore once, quietly, and pressed his fist against his thigh and kept working. Victoria brought him a glass of water at noon and didn't comment on the split knuckle and didn't offer sympathy he didn't need. And he drank the water in 3 long swallows and handed back the glass, and she took it without making anything of the exchange. At 1:15, he put the tools down and looked at the finished ramp. It was correct. The angle was right, the surface had the right grip texture, The handrail was set at the proper height. It would hold. It would hold for 20 years if the base didn't heave, and the base wouldn't heave because he'd poured it right. Victoria rolled to the top of it and looked down the run. Then she moved forward, slowly, taking the ramp down with her hands on the wheels in the careful, controlled way that said she'd learned to read surfaces by the way her chair behaved on them. She reached the bottom and sat for a moment. "Better," she said. "It'll only improve as it cures. Give it a week before you take it at any speed." She turned her chair and looked back up the ramp at him. "Thank you," she said, and then with a directness that was specifically hers. "I mean that, for coming back, not just for the work." He looked at the ramp, then at her. "I know you do." He loaded his tools into the truck, and Gerald came out with an envelope. The remaining contract balance, he said, plus the cancellation fee from before, which he said Ms. Ashford had asked to be refunded since the work was now completed. Derek started to say that wasn't necessary. Gerald held up one hand with calm finality and said, "She was specific about it, Mr. Holloway." He took the envelope. He was backing the truck toward the gate when his phone buzzed. The East Garden Path, when it stops being cold enough to affect the pour. "I need it done properly, and I'd like it to be you." He read it twice. Typed back, "Spring." Her response came in under 10 seconds. "Spring." He put the truck in drive and went home to pick up Emma from her pottery thing, and she came out holding a lopsided bowl she had made with her own hands that she was very proud of, and she said, "Guess what, Dad? I made a bowl. You can put keys in it." He looked at the bowl, which was dark blue and uneven in a way that was charming. "It's perfect," he said. "It's a little crooked. That's what makes it interesting." She considered that with the look she gave things she was deciding whether to believe. Then she climbed in the truck, buckled up, and said, "Did you finish the ramp?" "Yeah." "Is it good?" "It's good." She nodded, satisfied, and looked out the window at the December street. "I sent Rocky a drawing," she said casually. "I know, Victoria told me." A short pause, then, with studied casualness, "She mentioned me?" "She did." Emma said nothing for a moment, but he could see in the rearview mirror that she was working very hard not to look pleased about this. She was only partially successful. She was 7 years old and she had her mother's heart, which meant she cared deeply about more things than she would ever fully admit to. He drove through the gray December streets and thought about spring arriving in a text message, like a small, careful promise, and the way a lopsided bowl could hold things that mattered, and the fact that sometimes the distance between two people wasn't fixed. It was structural, like a path, like a ramp, like something that had been built wrong the first time but could, with the right materials and enough patience, be corrected. He didn't let himself think past that. Not yet. But he thought about it. Spring came to Seattle the way it always did. Slowly, then all at once. The gray lifting in degrees until one morning you looked outside and the light was genuinely different, and the cold had backed off enough that you could stand on a sidewalk without bracing against it. Derek noticed it first on a Tuesday in mid-March, driving the drainage route along the waterfront, when the cherry trees on the boulevard were doing what they did every year, that brief, almost aggressive display of pink that lasted maybe 2 weeks before the petals came down, and the city went green again. Emma had made him stop the truck 2 years running to look at them properly. She considered the cherry blossoms a significant annual event and approached them with appropriate ceremony. He'd texted Victoria a photo of them once, on impulse, and then immediately felt like it was a strange thing to have done, and had almost followed it with something that explained or deflected. He didn't, in the end. He just sent the photo. She'd sent back, "They're better in person. Come by and look at the ones on the East Slope sometime." He hadn't yet. But spring had arrived, which meant the East Garden Path was back in range, and Victoria had been as good as her word about most things, so he wasn't surprised when the text came on a Wednesday morning in late March. "Ground's ready. When can you start?" He typed back, "Saturday." The shareholders' meeting had happened in February, and it had apparently gone the way Victoria needed it to, because the board hadn't made any more moves through corporate liaisons, and the profile pieces she'd done in January had landed well enough that the business press was running the Ashford Industries recovery narrative without editorial skepticism. Derek knew this not because Victoria told him directly, but because she occasionally mentioned things sideways, in the way of someone who had learned to share information in careful increments. He knew she'd fired one of the board members in the third week of February, not from her, but from Tomas, who had read it in a financial news aggregator with the slightly gleeful energy of someone who followed corporate drama the way other people followed sports. "Your lady fired Westbrook," Thomas had said, and Derek had said, "She's not my lady," on reflex, and Thomas had said, "Right, sure," with a tone that indicated he found this response entirely unconvincing. He wasn't wrong, exactly. Something had shifted over the winter, in the space between the December Saturday and now. Not dramatically. Victoria wasn't a dramatic person, and neither was Derek particularly, but the texts had continued, and they'd gotten more frequent, and they'd stopped being entirely about the work. She'd sent him an article about base concrete formulations once, which he'd read and responded to at some length. He'd sent her the cherry blossoms. She'd called him on a Thursday evening in January to ask his opinion on a ramp design specification she'd received from a contractor who was doing work at Ashford Industries' main building. And they'd ended up talking for 40 minutes about the design, and then for another 20 about nothing in particular. And Emma had come out of her room twice during the second part of the conversation to ask him questions that could definitely have waited, which he was fairly certain was because she could tell from his voice that something was different about the call. Emma didn't say anything about it. She was 7 going on 35, and she had a gift for knowing when to let things develop without interference. The East Garden path was more extensive than the repairs he'd done in the fall. It ran along the full eastern boundary of the estate grounds, maybe 80 feet of flagstone path with an integrated gravel border that had been beautiful once and had been poorly maintained for several years. The flagstones themselves were mostly intact, but the base had washed out in sections, causing the stones to tip and shift, and there were 3 transitions: from path to grass, path to patio. Path to the small accessible garden Victoria had apparently stopped using because reaching it required navigating one of the problem sections. He walked it on the first Saturday morning while Victoria sat near the garden access point and drank coffee and looked at the section of neglected garden beds with an expression he'd come to recognize as her assessing face. Not sad, not resigned, just measuring. "The beds are a mess," she said. "I can fix the path. The beds are your problem." "I know." She looked at them. "I used to garden. Before." He didn't push on before. He'd learned the terrain well enough to know which things she'd tell him in her own time and which things she'd retreat from if he asked directly. "The lavender's still alive," he said, looking at the far bed. "It's tough. It'll come back if someone tends it. I'm not much for tending things from a chair. There are adaptive tools, raised bed frames, extended handles." He looked at the angle of the garden. "If the path reaches the main bed properly, the access is actually decent. You'd need a wider turning radius at the entrance. I can build that in." She looked at him. "You're designing my garden now?" "I'm designing your path. The garden is incidental." Something moved at the edge of her mouth. Not quite the involuntary smile, but related to it. "All right," she said. "Build it with the turning radius." He spent 3 Saturdays on the path, and the third one Emma came too because the pottery place was doing a spring class, and Emma had developed opinions about pottery. She came in the late morning after the class, still smelling faintly of clay, and she went immediately to check on Rocky the garnet stone, and then came to find Victoria with the bowl she'd finished glazing, which was still lopsided but now also teal. "I made you something," Emma said, holding it out. Victoria looked at the bowl. "You made me a bowl." "For keys, or other things. Dad has one too." Emma looked at her own work critically. "It's a little crooked." "It has character," Victoria said, which was almost word for word what Derek had said about Emma's bowl in December. And Emma beamed at her like she'd said exactly the right thing. She set the bowl on the garden wall near Rocky and stood back to assess the visual relationship between them. "They match," she announced. "They do," Victoria agreed. "I planned it that way," Emma said, which was not true, but also not entirely the point. Derek watched this from where he was compacting the gravel base on the middle section of path, on his knees in the dirt, his hands in work gloves, the late April sun actually warm on his back for the first time since October. He watched the two of them by the garden wall. Emma explaining something with her hands, Victoria leaning forward slightly to see what she was being shown, and he felt something that he didn't have a clean word for. Not happiness exactly, or not only that, more like recognition, like seeing something that had been slightly wrong for a long time and was now incrementally less wrong. He went back to compacting the gravel. The east path was finished on a Saturday in early May, and Derek had stepped back to look at the full run. Flagstones re-leveled, joints reset. The transition widened at the garden entrance the way he'd said, the gravel border neat and contained, and felt the specific, uncomplicated satisfaction of work that was done right. Victoria came down the path slowly, reading the surface the way she always did, making the small adjustments any experienced wheelchair user made through any new terrain. She went all the way to the garden entrance, through the wider turning radius, and sat at the edge of the neglected beds. She was quiet for a while. "The lavender," she said finally. "Still alive," he confirmed. She reached out and touched one of the dried stalks. The gesture was careful, not tentative, just precise, like she was checking for something she wasn't sure would still be there. "I'll need those adaptive tool recommendations," she said. "I'll look some up." She didn't respond immediately, and he started collecting his tools. And when she spoke again, her voice was slightly different, lower and less managed. "This is the first time I've been in this part of the garden in 14 months, she said. He stopped, didn't say anything. "The accident was in this part of the property." She said it evenly, but the evenness was the product of effort, not of distance. "Not in the garden, near it. I lost control of the chair on the slope above the east wall. I hit the retaining wall at the bottom." A pause. The spinal injury was from the impact, not from the fall itself. He was very still. "I came outside because I was frustrated with a call," she said. "It was a stupid reason to be moving too fast on a grade I knew was steep. And I knew the brake was—" She stopped. "I'd been meaning to get it serviced. I kept postponing it." He understood why she was telling him now, in this place. Not because she needed to, but because this was where it had happened, and she'd come back to it, and it was the kind of thing that wanted to be said out loud in the place where it lived. "I don't think I've said that to anyone before," she said, "that I knew about the break." "You were on Cresthaven when I found you," he said. "That's a long way from the east wall." "I got further than I thought before the cable gave completely." A short pause. "I was trying to get somewhere. I don't know where exactly. Just out." He sat down on the low garden wall. Not close, not with any intention, just because it seemed wrong to stand over her. The May afternoon was quiet, and the lavender was in front of them, and the estate grounds stretched out beyond that. And somewhere in the direction of the house, he could hear Emma talking to Gerald about something, her voice clear and carrying the way it did. "The brake cable that snapped on Cresthaven," he said. "Was that the same chair?" "No. Different chair, same problem, different day." She looked at the lavender. "I think part of me stopped maintaining things for a while, including myself." He didn't offer a response to that because the kind of thing she was describing didn't want a response. It wanted space. They sat there for a while in the afternoon quiet. "I haven't told anyone on the board," she said, "about what caused the accident. They know I was injured on the property and that it required surgery. That's what the lawyers advised." "That's between you and your lawyers." "I know." A pause. "I'm telling you." He looked at her. She was looking at the lavender, not at him, and her profile in the late afternoon light had that quality it sometimes had of a person who had been very careful for a very long time and was, in small increments, testing what happened if she wasn't. "I'm glad you made it to Cresthaven," he said, "both times." She was quiet for a moment, then, "So am I," said quietly and meaning it. Emma appeared at the garden entrance, slightly out of breath, holding a sprig of something she'd found near the estate wall. "Gerald says there's rosemary growing wild by the north fence," she announced. "He says we can have some. Can we take some home?" "Ask Gerald if he means it," Derek said. "He definitely means it," Emma said, already turning back. Victoria watched her go. "She's going to ask for the whole plant," she said. "She absolutely is." Victoria shook her head. but the involuntary smile was there fully this time, and she didn't manage it away. Sit. June arrived, and the garden, tended by Victoria with the adaptive tools Derek had sourced and dropped off on a weekday without ceremony, began to look like something again. The lavender came back with the stubbornness that lavender always has. There were other things she'd planted from small starts. He didn't know their names, mostly, but he knew the garden had color now, where before there was only gray. He came to the estate most Saturdays, not always with work of his own, but sometimes because she asked him to look at something. A section of the driveway that was showing early stress fractures, a drainage issue on the north slope that needed assessment. He didn't overcharge her. She didn't underpay him. The arrangement had an equilibrium that neither of them examined too directly. Emma came when she wasn't doing other things, which was most of the time because her summer had fewer structured commitments, and she had appointed herself Rocky's seasonal correspondent, keeping the Garnet Stone updated on developments in her life with a regularity that she apparently considered a moral obligation. It was on a Saturday in late June that Victoria first mentioned the idea. They were sitting in the carport after the work was done. Derek with coffee, Victoria with tea, both of them tired in the specific good way of an afternoon that had produced something tangible. Emma was somewhere in the garden, having been given temporary stewardship of a small watering can and what Gerald described as light duties. "I've been thinking about the accident," Victoria said, "not the way I used to think about it." He waited. "The path here, all the accessibility problems that existed before you came, the ramp, the cracked sections, the threshold." She turned the tea mug in her hands. "I spent 14 months inside this estate, partially, because going outside involved navigating things that had stopped working, things that should have been maintained and weren't, things that nobody prioritized because nobody had to live with the consequences." She paused. "And I thought, that's not just here. That's everywhere." "It is," he said. "There's a route," she said, "in Cascade Park, the rehabilitation trail that runs along the north side. I used it before, when I was doing post-accident mobility work. About 8 months in, when I was ready to try." She stopped. "It's not accessible for people who need it to be. It's technically accessible on paper. In practice, it fails at multiple points. The grades are wrong. The surface material breaks down. The benches and rest points are placed with no understanding of where people actually need them." He looked at her. He could see where this was going, and the part of his brain that had been dormant for a long time was paying attention. "You want to fix it," he said. "I want to redesign it," she said. "Not patch it, redesign, from the foundation, with someone who understands what the surface actually needs to do." She looked at him. "I've spoken with the Parks Department. There's a grant framework for rehabilitation infrastructure. The city is interested. My foundation would provide matching funds." He set down the coffee. "Your foundation?" "Ashford Community Foundation. It's been operational for years, mostly arts funding." A pause. "I want to redirect a portion of it." He was quiet for a moment. "You want me to design it?" "I want your technical knowledge." She was direct, the way she always was. "You have 2 years of civil engineering. You've done IDEA compliance work. You understand grade and surface and load. You know what fails and why." She held his gaze. "I'm not offering this as charity. I know what the design scope would cost from a firm. I'm offering it as a contract, properly paid." He looked at his hands, the coffee mug, the estate grounds visible through the carport opening, the garden he'd spent 3 Saturdays repathing. "You looked up my university records." Gerald did. Due diligence. Not apologetic, but not defensive either. "You never mentioned the engineering." "It was 2 years I didn't finish." 2 years of applied civil and structural is not nothing, and you've spent 8 years doing practical implementation. She set down her tea. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you could do it. I don't ask for things I don't believe in." He knew this was true. It was one of the things he'd learned about her that felt solid and reliable. She didn't perform confidence she didn't have, and she didn't offer things she wasn't prepared to follow through on. She was sometimes difficult and occasionally curt, and had a way of going quiet that meant the conversation was closed that took some getting used to, but she didn't waste things, including words. "It would need to be evenings and weekends," he said. "I can't drop the city work yet." "That's fine." "I'd need full access to the site data, existing survey, utility maps." I've already requested them. He looked at her. You requested them before you asked me. I like to have things ready. He almost laughed at that. It wasn't quite a laugh, more like the beginning of one that he redirected. What are we calling this? She'd thought about that. He could tell. Hope Path, she said. Simple enough that people understand it, specific enough to mean something. He repeated it quietly. Hope Path. It didn't feel too large or too small. It felt right, which was its own kind of answer. All right, he said, show me what you've got on the site. The storm came in August with almost no warning. The forecast had mentioned elevated storm activity and possible localized flooding. This was Seattle. It was August. Those forecasts existed approximately every third week and usually meant heavy rain and one downed tree somewhere on the east side. Derek was on a city overnight call dealing with a drainage overflow near the Fremont Bridge, which was running worse than expected because the upstream basin had taken on more volume than the system was designed to handle. He'd been out there since 9 p.m. It was past midnight when his radio picked up the first reports of structural incidents in the upper residential district, landslide activity on the North Ridge, power outages spreading through the hill neighborhoods. The roads above Crest Haven closed due to a debris flow that had taken out the eastbound lane entirely. He felt the specific cold thing happen in his chest that happened when you heard a location before you'd had time to process it. He tried Victoria's number, voicemail. He tried the estate's main line, which Gerald answered, and Gerald's voice was different than Derek had ever heard it. Still composed, but underneath the composure, something tight and controlled. Ms. Ashford was in the east wing when the power went out, Gerald said. She was attempting to reach the housekeeper. Mrs. Park fell on the back stairs in the dark. I've been trying to find them both. The east corridor access... A pause. My knees, Mr. Holloway. I can't move as fast as I need to. I'm coming, Derek said. Tomas looked at him from the other side of the drainage site. Derek had already started moving toward his truck. Holloway, cover me. Personal emergency. He drove through flooded streets with the truck's amber emergency light on, which didn't give him any real authority but made other cars move. The main road up to Crest Haven was closed, but the service road from the south side wasn't, and he took it hard, the truck handling poorly in standing water, and got through the estate's workers' entrance with the code that he hadn't been asked to return, and that still worked. The estate was dark, not the partial darkness of a power outage with some emergency lighting, completely dark, which meant the backup generator had failed too or hadn't engaged. He grabbed his heavy work flashlight from the truck and the emergency kit from the cab and went in through the side entrance. Gerald! He kept his voice controlled. Main corridor. From somewhere ahead of him, he moved fast through the dark, the flashlight cutting a clean beam through the black interior, running the path from memory. He'd been through this entrance enough times to know the turns. The main corridor was to the left, the east wing branching off it, and he found Gerald at the corridor junction, standing with one hand on the wall, pointing. East wing. She went to help Mrs. Park, and I haven't been able to reach them since the power dropped. Derek handed Gerald the smaller emergency flashlight from the kit. Stay here. I'll find them. The east wing was a long corridor with the garden access on one end and the housekeeper's quarters and utility rooms on the other. Derek moved fast, sweeping the light, calling her name. He found them in the utility anteroom near the back stairs. Mrs. Park was sitting against the wall, one ankle extended, clearly in pain, but conscious and alert, a bruise rising on her left forearm where she'd caught herself on the stairs. Victoria was on the floor beside her. She'd overturned. Her chair was on its side about 4 feet away. She'd clearly come down the corridor in the dark, misjudged the threshold into the anteroom. One of the thresholds Derek hadn't gotten to yet. One of the ones on the north side that was on the list for fall. And the chair had caught the edge and gone over. She was sitting up against the wall with her back straight and her arms braced, and she had a cut on her forehead from something, not deep but bleeding in the way head cuts did, and she was holding Mrs. Park's hand with both of hers. Derek, she said. Not surprised, not relieved, or not showing it yet. Just his name, in a voice that was very even and very controlled and also, underneath that, very tired. Hey. He came down to their level, crouching, sweeping the room quick with the light to check for any immediate structural hazard, then focusing on them. Mrs. Park, what hurts? My ankle, Mrs. Park said. I don't think it's broken. I've broken bones before, and this feels different. She was in her 60s, small, very calm, and was clearly trying not to be a bigger problem than she already was. I'm so sorry about this. Not your fault. He looked at her ankle, swelling, but the alignment looked okay. Can you move your toes? She could. All right, don't put weight on it. I'm going to get you both out of here and then we can look at it properly. He looked at Victoria. The cut on her forehead was still bleeding. I'm fine, she said before he could ask. You're bleeding. I know, it's not serious. He pulled the emergency kit and got the compression pad and held it out to her. She took it and pressed it to her forehead herself, with the self-sufficient precision of someone who had learned to handle her own physical management without assistance as a matter of necessary pride. The chair, she said. He went to it. The chair was on its side, but intact. The frame hadn't bent. The wheels were undamaged. He righted it and checked the brake cable and the axle mounts and the frame integrity with the flashlight in his hands. It's okay, he said. Cable's fine, frame's fine. He helped her back into it, a process that was complicated in the dark, and she had to accept more physical assistance than she'd ordinarily allow. And he could feel the tension in her where she was managing the difficulty of needing help. And he didn't comment on any of it and didn't make it into something, just did what needed to be done. When she was settled and upright, she was breathing slightly harder than usual, and her jaw was set. Thank you, she said. Let's get Mrs. Park out first. Between the two of them, him lifting, her directing, Mrs. Park being determinedly cooperative despite obvious pain, they got the housekeeper to the main corridor and settled on the broad window bench with her ankle elevated, and then Gerald was there with a second flashlight and the kind of efficient calm Derek had come to associate with people who had spent their lives handling other people's crises. Victoria came to a stop at the corridor window. Outside, the storm was still running, rain coming sideways, the estate grounds half visible in the dark. A tree somewhere to the north had come down. Derek could see the shape of it in the faint light from the neighborhood below. Emergency services? She asked. Blocked roads, Derek said. I came through the service route. That may close too if the drainage doesn't hold. He looked out at the grounds. I need to check the east wall drain. If that overflows, it'll come into the basement. Gerald knows where the... Gerald's staying with Mrs. Park. He looked at her. You know where the drain is? A short silence. She did know. He could see her calculating it, and he could see the specific difficulty of being told she was needed to navigate across a property that was dark and flooded and where she'd just overturned, and the separate difficulty of not wanting to need him to take her there. The East Garden path, she said. It'll hold. I poured that right. She looked at him for a moment. I know you did, she said. He checked the east wall drain with the heavy flashlight and confirmed it was blocked with debris, a mass of leaves and broken material the storm had pushed against the grate. He cleared it with a stick from the garden and watched the water level start to drop, which meant the backup wouldn't reach the basement if the rain stayed at the current level. Victoria had stayed at the garden entrance with her flashlight trained on the drain so he could see it to work, which was a practical thing that required her to be outside in the rain, and she hadn't mentioned it once. When he straightened up and came back to the path she was wet through, her hair flat against her face, the compression pad still held to her forehead. Drain's clear, he said. Good. You need to get inside. I know. She didn't move immediately. She was looking at the estate grounds in the storm dark, the shapes of the trees bent by wind, the garden she'd spent the spring rebuilding. Her hands were on her wheels, and her face was turned slightly up like she was taking the rain rather than avoiding it. He stood with her for a moment, in the rain, saying nothing. I'm going to be all right, she said. And it wasn't for him. It was said the way people say things they've been needing to say to themselves. I know you are, he said. She looked at him, and in the dark and the rain her face had no performance in it at all. It was just her, the unmanaged version that he'd seen in pieces over months and was only now seen fully. And it was nothing like the profile pieces, and nothing like the CEO, and nothing like the careful, controlled person who'd taken the corporate hit to protect him in December. It was just a person who was tired and hurting and still sitting upright. I sent them away, she said, meaning him, meaning December, meaning all of it. Because I was afraid of what they'd do to you, and I told myself it was the right thing. Her voice was flat and direct. But it was also because if I let you matter and then something happened, she stopped. I've lost things before. He didn't fill the silence. I don't know what I'm asking, she said. I'm not asking anything. I'm just... She pressed her lips together. I needed you to know that I know why I did it. And it was cowardly, and it was also scared. Both. The rain came down around them. The garden was dark, and the lavender was being hammered flat by the weather, and the east path, which he had poured right, held the weight of both of them without shifting. I'm not going anywhere, he said. I haven't been. I've just been waiting for you to stop trying to make that decision for me. She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. That's frustrating to hear, she said finally. I know. Because you're right. I know that too. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite the involuntary smile and wasn't quite crying. Somewhere between them, in the territory that exhaustion and rain and honesty between two people occupy at midnight in a storm. Let's go inside, she said. They went inside, and Gerald had found candles and had Mrs. Park's ankle properly elevated and had produced tea from somewhere with the inexplicable competence of a man who simply handled things. And they sat in the candlelit corridor while the storm ran its course outside. And nobody said anything particularly important, and all of it mattered anyway. At 2 a.m, the power came back on, and the emergency lights blinked out and the regular lights blinked in, and everyone looked slightly startled by the return of the ordinary world. Derek checked Mrs. Park's ankle one more time, still swelling, probably a sprain, should be seen in the morning. Gerald said he would arrange a doctor. Mrs. Park said she was very sorry to have caused trouble, and Derek said she hadn't, and Victoria said nothing but reached over and patted Mrs. Park's hand once, briefly, before withdrawing. He left at 2:30. Victoria walked him, rolled him, to the side entrance, and they stood in the doorway with the rain down to a murmur now, the worst of it past. The threshold, she said, looking at the entry. He looked too. The threshold he'd gone over his list and not yet gotten to. Next weekend, he said. She looked at him. Next weekend, she said. And it had the same quality as spring in the December text, small and careful and meaning more than its syllables. He drove home through the wet streets, the city putting itself back together around the night's damage, and thought about a woman turning her face up into the rain and saying, I'm going to be all right, like it was something she was deciding, not predicting. He thought she probably was. The threshold got fixed the following weekend, same as he'd said. Derek arrived at 8 on Saturday morning with the right materials already in the truck, and he had the north entrance threshold leveled and sealed before 10. And when he was done, Victoria rolled over it twice in both directions and said nothing, which he'd learned meant the work was correct. She only said something when it wasn't. Mrs. Park's ankle had been a moderate sprain. The doctor Gerald arranged had confirmed it the morning after the storm, and she'd been on limited duties for 2 weeks and was now back at partial capacity and had, according to Gerald, resumed making her opinions about the kitchen organization known to everyone within earshot, which he described as a sign of full recovery. Derek had stopped by once during the recovery period, not for any work reason, but because Mrs. Park had sent him a card through Gerald, an actual physical card, handwritten, thanking him for the night of the storm. And it seemed right to come in person. She'd made him sit at the kitchen table and fed him soup and told him about her late husband and her daughter in Portland and the 16 years she'd worked at the estate, and he'd listened properly, and she'd seemed to appreciate it. Victoria had appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point during this and looked at the two of them at the table and said nothing and went away again, but the quality of her silence had been warm. He noticed things like that now. He'd been noticing them for a while. Listen, Hope Path had its own rhythm by September, and it was a different kind of work than anything Derek had done in years. Different from city maintenance, which was reactive, a go here, fix this, move on. Different from the estate work, which was contained and known. This was design work, longitudinal thinking. Standing at the north end of the Cascade Park Trail with a survey map and his own measurements, and the question of how a path could be made to serve the people who actually needed it, not the people who'd been assumed to need it when someone drew the original plans decades ago. He'd driven the route a dozen times in the first month. He'd sat at the rest points, the ones that existed, and tried to understand what they'd gotten wrong. The bench placement was the most obvious failure. They'd been installed at regular intervals like decorative furniture, not at the actual points where a person with limited mobility or strength would need them. The grade changes were wrong in two critical places. Not dramatically wrong, but wrong enough that someone in a manual chair on a bad day would hit those points and either struggle through or turn back. The surface material at the north transition was a coarse aggregate that was fine for walking but caught wheels in a way that would make a person doubt the whole route before they'd gotten 30 feet into it. He'd written all of it out in a document that started as rough notes and had become, over several weeks of evenings after Emma was in bed, a full design brief. He wasn't a professional technical writer. His language was plain, his diagrams hand-drawn and then photographed because he didn't have the drafting software. But the thinking behind it was clear and specific and grounded in what he'd learned from 8 years of watching infrastructure fail and from everything he'd understood but not used from his 2 years of engineering coursework. He'd sent it to Victoria on a Thursday night in September with a text that said, "First pass. Tell me what's wrong with it." She'd called him 20 minutes later. "Nothing's wrong with it," she said. "There's always something wrong with a first pass. The rest point placement is right. The grade corrections are right. The surface specification for the north transition is right." She paused. "The budget estimate is slightly conservative on the subbase for Section 3, but that's a numbers adjustment, not a design issue." He'd been sitting at the kitchen table in the specific quiet of a house where an 8-year-old was asleep 2 rooms away, which had a particular texture he'd come to value. "You know what the subbase specification should cost?" "I looked it up," said without any self-consciousness, which was entirely consistent with who she was. "You understand the design. I'll handle the budget modeling. We're going to need a proper cost summary for the Parks Department proposal and for the Foundation Board." "When's the Parks Department meeting?" "I pushed it to October. I wanted the design document solid before we go in." He'd looked down at the document spread on the table, the hand-drawn diagrams, the careful notes in the margins where he'd been thinking out loud on paper. "This is going to need clean drafts. I know someone who can draft from field documents. She does infrastructure work." A pause. "She'll need a briefing from you. An hour, maybe 2. "All right. Derek." Her voice was careful in the way it got when she was about to say something she'd thought about. "This is good work. I want you to know I'm saying that as someone who reviews engineering proposals, not as someone who knows you." He'd been quiet for a moment, understanding what she was doing, drawing the line between the professional and the personal, so he knew the compliment was real and not colored by anything else. "Thank you," he said. "That means something." "I know it does. That's why I said it." October moved fast. The Parks Department meeting went better than Derek had expected, and more smoothly than he had reason to hope for, partly because Victoria was in the room, and Victoria, in a professional setting, was a different version of her than the one who sat in the carport garden or held a cup of tea in a power outage corridor. She was precise and prepared, and she'd anticipated every objection before it was raised. And when the department director tried to redirect the conversation toward a less expensive patching approach, Victoria had dismantled that option so efficiently and so without drama that the director had actually paused and then said, "Let's see the full proposal." Afterward, in the parking lot, Derek had looked at her and said, "You do that differently than I expected." "Do what?" "The room, the meeting." She'd considered this. "I've been in a lot of rooms," she said. "You learn what works." "You knew he was going to try the patching redirect." "Of course. It's always the first cost objection." She looked at him sideways. "You held your own in there." "I know the design." "You knew it better than anyone else in the room, and you didn't let them make you feel like you didn't." She said it matter-of-factly. "That's not nothing." He thought about that for the rest of the day, in the specific way of a compliment that lands differently than expected, not because it was excessive, but because it was precise. Emma, when he picked her up that evening, asked how the meeting went, and he said well, and she said, "Did Victoria go too?" And he said yes, and she said, "Good. She's good at meetings. She looks like someone who's good at meetings." He didn't ask her how she'd reached that conclusion. He accepted it as true, which it was. By November, Hope Path had cleared its first funding approval. The Parks Department had committed their portion, the Ashford Community Foundation had committed matching funds, and the timeline for breaking ground was projected for the following spring, which was tight but achievable if the final permitting cleared before December. There was a contractor bidding process underway. There was a community consultation event scheduled for the third week of November. There was also a journalist. Her name was Priya Mehta, and she wrote for a regional publication that did long-form city stories, and she'd been following the Hope Path planning process since the Parks Department meeting because someone on the department staff had mentioned it to someone else, and it had found its way to her. She was thorough and fair, and Derek had spoken with her twice by phone at Victoria's request, the first time briefly, the second time for nearly an hour because Priya had actual questions, not softball questions, and he'd respected that and answered them straight. The profile ran in mid-November under the headline, "The Path Back," how one CEO's personal recovery became a public infrastructure movement. It was about Victoria primarily, but it was also about Hope Path as a design, and it quoted Derek twice, once on the technical failure points of the original trail, and once, near the end, on what he thought the project was actually for. "People give up on paths when paths give up on them first," the piece quoted him. "If something's supposed to get you somewhere and it fails you halfway through, you start to believe the problem is you. That's what bad infrastructure does. It tells people a lie about their own limits." He hadn't realized he'd said it quite that way until he read it back. Emma read the piece over his shoulder at the kitchen table and was quiet for a moment when she finished. "That's you in the picture," she said, pointing to the photo. It was him at the Cascade Park site, crouching over the surface transition point, taken by the publication's photographer on a gray afternoon. He looked like he was working, which he had been. "I know. You look serious." "I was thinking." She read the quote again. "People give up on paths when paths give up on them first," she repeated slowly, in the way she repeated things she was filing somewhere. "Did you make that up?" "Apparently." She thought about it. "It's good," she said, with the evaluative certainty of an 8-year-old who had opinions about language. "It sounds like something someone would put on a wall." He laughed, a real one, at that, the kind that came without preparation. Just. Victoria read the piece the night it ran and texted him at 9:45 p.m. "You gave Priya the best quote in the article." He wrote back, "You gave her the story." A pause. Then, "We gave her the story." He read that twice, sitting on the edge of his bed, and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized as the kind of quiet that came after something was finally said right. They didn't talk about what they were to each other, not in explicit terms, not in the language people usually used for it. But something had changed after the storm and the rain in the corridor, and neither of them was pretending it hadn't. He came to the estate most Saturdays and sometimes on weekday evenings when the Hope Path design needed working on, and they sat at the long table in Victoria's study, which was full of books and organized with a precision that bordered on aggressive. And they worked on the design documents and argued about grade tolerances and drank coffee that was better than any coffee Derek had ever made himself. And sometimes the working stopped and the talking continued, and sometimes that went until 11 or later, and he drove home in the dark thinking about all of it. Emma had started calling Victoria by name without prompting, which she hadn't done initially. She'd been careful, the way perceptive children are careful about things that matter. Now she said it easily, naturally, the way you say the name of someone who is simply part of your life. Gerald had started including Emma in the list of people he prepared for when Derek was expected at the estate. There would be a glass of the specific juice she liked and something small to eat, and once, when Emma had mentioned in passing that she was working on a project about birds, a library book about Pacific Northwest bird species that Gerald had produced from somewhere with no explanation and simply placed on the table beside her glass. The estate had changed too, or more precisely, Derek's experience of it had changed. It still felt large, but it was objectively very large, but the specific silence it had carried in those first November Saturdays was gone. It felt like a place where things happened now, where people moved through the rooms with ordinary purposes, and the kitchen made sounds in the afternoon, and the garden had color that someone was tending. He knew he had contributed to that, He was honest enough with himself to know it and to feel, quietly, something like satisfaction in it. Not pride exactly, but the related thing. The sense of having built something that functioned. The community consultation for Hope Path happened on a Thursday evening in a neighborhood community center in the Cascade District. A school gymnasium type of room, folding chairs, tables with the design boards Gerald and the foundation staff had put together from Derek's documents, coffee, and cookies in the corner that people made disproportionate use of. Derek stood near the grade diagram for most of the evening, answering questions from people who came to look, and Victoria moved through the room with the ease of someone who had years of practice in exactly this kind of event, but who was also, he noticed, more present than she was at formal corporate things. She stopped near a man in a power wheelchair who'd been studying the rest point placement diagram for a while. A man in his 40s, Derek estimated, with the focused expression of someone who was measuring what he was seeing against his own experience. "The intervals," the man said to Victoria, not aggressively, but pointedly. "These are different from the current path." "Yes," Victoria said. "The current intervals are decorative. These are based on where people actually need to stop." The man looked at her. "How do you know where people actually need to stop?" A short pause. "I've needed to stop," she said. Simply. The man looked at her for a moment, then back at the diagram. He asked several specific and intelligent questions about the grade corrections and the surface specification, and Victoria answered the ones she could and said Derek knows the technical detail on that one for the ones she couldn't. And Derek came over, and they had a conversation that went on for 20 minutes and ended with the man saying, "This is the first time I've looked at a public path project and felt like someone was actually designing it for me." Derek drove home that night with that sentence sitting in his chest. Emma was asleep when he got in. Mrs. Caldera had stayed late, and he looked in on her the way he always did. One lamp in the hallway, the edge of the blanket folded down. She was sleeping on her side with one hand tucked under her chin, and she looked exactly like herself, which was the most reassuring thing he knew how to see. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after, not doing anything in particular. The rocky drawing was still on the refrigerator. Emma had put it up herself in October and seemed to consider it permanent. The teal bowl sat on the counter. It was full of keys, as Emma had intended. He thought about the man at the consultation. He thought about Victoria saying, "I've needed to stop with no performance in it," to a stranger in a gymnasium. He thought about how far that was from the woman who hadn't been outside her own estate for 14 months, who had let the brake cable go unfixed because she'd stopped maintaining things, including herself. He thought about what it took to come back from that. The specific daily labor of it. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the accumulated choices of someone who decided, 1 degree at a time, to be less small. He was in love with her. He'd known it for a while in the way you know things you're not ready to say out loud yet. Not as a revelation, more like something that had been there since somewhere around the spring, getting clear, and he'd been letting it get clear rather than naming it, because naming things changed them, and he wasn't in a hurry. He was 32 years old, and he had a daughter and a city job and a life that had been carefully reassembled from difficult materials, and he wasn't going to rush something that mattered. But it was true. That was the fact. He went to bed without doing anything with it, which felt right for right now. December returned to the calendar, and Emma declared that Rocky needed a winter update, which involved another drawing, a more sophisticated one than the first. She was 8 now, and her technique had developed, that she sent through Gerald to the estate address. She'd received a letter back from Victoria the previous spring, an actual handwritten letter on good paper, which Emma had read 3 times, and then placed carefully in the box under her bed, where she kept things that mattered. She'd mentioned the letter to Derek only once and indirectly, which meant it was important enough to protect. The permitting cleared in the second week of December, 9 days before the holiday break, and Derek was eating a sandwich in the city truck when Victoria called. "We're cleared," she said. "All of it?" "All of it. Groundbreaking in March if the weather cooperates." He set down the sandwich. "Mark, I know." He could hear the specific quality of her trying not to be too openly pleased, the way she managed things that mattered because managing them felt safer than not. "The foundation board wants a ceremony, media presence. I told them we'd think about it." "You want a ceremony?" A pause. "I want it to be real more than I want it to be seen," she said. but I understand why visibility matters for what comes after. What comes after? If this works, she stopped. When this works, there are 3 other Parks Department sites that have already informally asked about the same process, and the Foundation has been contacted by 2 other cities about the model. He was quiet for a moment. You're thinking bigger than one trail. I'm trying not to, she said. One thing at a time, but another pause. Yes, I'm thinking bigger. He looked out the truck window at the gray December street. The cherry trees were bare now, weeks past their spring moment, just branches. You need a director, he said, for the Foundation's accessibility program. Someone who can oversee the design standards and the contractor relationships and the site assessments. A silence that had a particular quality to it. I've been thinking about that, she said carefully. I know you have. Have you been thinking about it? He had been. More specifically, he'd been thinking about the city maintenance job, about what it had been at the start, when he'd needed stability and predictability and something that wouldn't ask too much of the parts of himself he couldn't afford to spend, and what it was now, which was something he'd done well for long enough that it had become comfortable in a way that comfort sometimes becomes a different kind of stuck. I'd need to finish the degree, he said, or at least the remaining coursework, for the credential to be credible. UW has a part-time completion track, Victoria said, in a tone that indicated she'd looked this up and was declining to comment on when. 18 months, evening and weekend format. You looked it up. I look things up. Victoria. Derek. He almost smiled. I'm not making any decisions today. I know. I'm not asking you to. She paused. I'm asking you to think about it. I've been thinking about it since June. A beat. I know, she said, quietly. He finished the sandwich and drank the cold coffee and went back to the drainage route. And Tomas didn't ask him anything because Tomas had learned the specific texture of Derek's moods by now and knew when to let things go. Christmas came and went. Emma got the pottery class series she'd wanted, and a book about bird species, and a small hand lens for examining interesting rocks and minerals, which last item had been purchased by Derek after consultation with Gerald, who had confirmed that yes, this would be well received, and no, he was not overstepping by asking. New Year's arrived with the specific quiet of a city that had been loud and was now temporarily still. Derek stood on the small balcony of his apartment at midnight with a glass of something, and the city below him doing what cities did at midnight on New Year's, lights and distant sounds, and the general sense of the calendar being turned. He thought about a year ago. A year ago, Emma had been 7, and he'd been doing the drain tape on Linden Avenue, and the name Victoria Ashford had meant a large empty estate at the top of Cresthaven and nothing else. He thought about the garnet stone, still sitting by the garden wall. He thought about the East Garden path, level and correctly surfaced now, the lavender coming back along its border. He thought about the ramp, the finished ramp, pitched right, anchored deep, something that would still be there in 20 years. He thought about design that told the truth, about structures that held what they were supposed to hold, about the difference between a thing that looked fine for 2 seasons and a thing that was built right. His phone buzzed. Happy New Year. The lavender is going to come back stronger this spring. I looked it up. A pause. Then, I'm glad you ran toward the hill that day. He read it twice, typed back. I'm glad you were rolling down it. 3 dots. A long pause. Then, that is a strange thing to be glad about. I know. Go to sleep, Derek. You go to sleep. A longer pause, then simply, good night. He stood on the balcony a little longer after that, with the city below him and the year just turned and everything still in front of them, and felt the particular quality of a life that had not gone the way he'd planned it, and had gone, in ways he hadn't expected, better. Not easier, not perfect, not without loss or difficulty or the specific ongoing weight of doing everything alone that you were not supposed to do alone, but real, and becoming, degree by degree, more. He went inside. He checked on Emma, who was asleep in the new year the same as she'd been in the old one. One hand tucked under her chin, the edge of the blanket folded down. He tucked the blanket back up. She stirred slightly, muttered something that might have been a word and might not have been, and settled again. He turned off the hall lamp, went to bed, let the year begin. March came in cold and clear, which was the best Seattle ever offered for outdoor work, and Derek stood at the north end of the Cascade Park Trail at 7:15 in the morning and watched the groundbreaking crew set up their equipment in the thin early light and felt something he didn't have a clean name for. Not pride, exactly. Something older than that. Something closer to recognition. The feeling of standing in a place where a thing you'd imagined was about to become physical, was about to stop being a document on a table and start being ground broken and material placed and structure raised. He'd felt it once or twice in his engineering coursework, back when he was 20 and hadn't yet learned how much could interrupt the distance between a plan and its completion. He'd thought he'd left that feeling behind when he left the program. Finding it again, here, on a trail in a public park at 7 in the morning with his breath visible in the cold air, felt like recovering something he hadn't known he'd been missing. Victoria arrived at 7:30, Gerald driving the estate car up the service access road. She'd insisted the groundbreaking be a working event, not a photo opportunity. There would be press there later, at 10, for the official ceremony portion, but the actual first work of the day would happen before cameras arrived, which Derek had agreed with entirely, and which had caused some friction with the Foundation's communications staff that Victoria had resolved by being Victoria. She got out of the car and looked at the site and said nothing for a moment. Just looked. He came to stand beside her. The trail ran north from where they were, through a corridor of Douglas fir and red alder, to the overlook point above the lake. In its current state, it was technically a trail, accessible on paper, degraded in practice, the accumulated result of years of maintenance that prioritized appearance over function. By the time they were finished, it would be something different, something that actually meant what it said. "Ready?" he asked. "I've been ready since October," she said. "I know. I meant today specifically." She looked at him sideways. "Yes, today specifically." A pause, and then something that wasn't quite a smile but was related to one. "Are you?" "Since June," he said, which was what she'd said to him in December, which she recognized immediately because she remembered everything. "That's fair," she said, and turned her chair toward the site. The groundbreaking ceremony at 10 was exactly what these things were. Speeches, a symbolic shovel in ground that wasn't actually the project soil, photographs, the Parks Department director saying the right things about community investment, Victoria at the microphone being precise and composed and saying, near the end, something that hadn't been in the prepared remarks. This trail failed the people it was supposed to serve, not dramatically, quietly, in the way that things fail when nobody who needs them to work has any power over whether they do. We're not fixing that by being generous. We're fixing it because it was wrong, and it was wrong for a long time, and it should have been fixed sooner. The director beside her looked briefly uncertain about whether to applaud that. The people in the gathered crowd who were there in wheelchairs and walkers and with mobility aids of various kinds applauded before he'd finished deciding. Derek stood at the back of the crowd and watched her at the microphone and thought about Cresthaven Road in the rain, about the way she'd looked coming down that hill. Jaw set, hands on the armrests, not screaming, already trying to solve it. He'd caught her that day. But that was the small part. The part that people told as a story. What had actually happened, the real version, was that they'd caught each other. Slowly, imperfectly, across months and setbacks, and one significant storm, and more cups of coffee than he could count, in a series of small decisions that didn't feel dramatic at the time, but had accumulated into something that held weight. That was how real things were built, not in moments, in the aggregate. Construction on Hope Path ran through April and May, and Derek was on site most days when he wasn't on city shift, managing the contractor relationships and the material delivery schedule and the grade verification at each section as it was completed. It was the most technically demanding work he'd done since leaving university, and it required him to go back to things he'd half remembered and verify them properly, which meant evenings with engineering references and a growing folder of notes that Emma had once picked up off the kitchen table, leafed through with the evaluative air of an academic reviewer, and said, "This looks like homework." "It is, sort of." She'd considered that. Are you going back to school? He'd been thinking about how to have this conversation for 2 months. Maybe. Would that be okay with you? She'd looked at him with the dark, serious eyes. Why wouldn't it be okay? It would mean some evenings being busier. You'd be with Mrs. Caldera more. I like Mrs. Caldera. I know you do. Emma had set the folder down and gone back to her drawing and then said, without looking up, Dad, you should do the things that are right, even if they're harder. She'd said it with the casual certainty of someone stating something obvious, as if she'd been carrying this position for a while and was mildly surprised he'd needed it explained. He'd looked at her bent head, the dark hair, the careful hand moving across the paper. When did you get so sensible? I've always been sensible, she said, which was partly true. He enrolled in the UW part-time completion track in April, evenings and Saturdays, 18 months to finish what he'd left. The first class was structural analysis, which was both the most relevant and the most demanding, and he sat in the back of the classroom on the first evening feeling slightly absurd. 32 years old, the oldest person in most of his classes by 8 years. And then the professor started talking about load distribution, and he stopped feeling absurd and started taking notes. He told Thomas about it the following week, and Thomas said, "Took you long enough," which was not the response Derek had expected, but was, on reflection, exactly right. Hope Path opened in June, not with a ceremony this time. That had happened at the groundbreaking, and Victoria had made clear that the opening itself should belong to the people who would use it, not to the people who'd built it. There was a soft opening on a Saturday morning. No press, no speeches, just the trail accessible and the gates open and a small sign at the north entrance that said Hope Path, Cascade Park Rehabilitation Trail with the Ashford Community Foundation mark in the corner, and below that, in smaller letters, designed to take you all the way. That last line had been Emma's. She'd been at the kitchen table one evening in April when Derek was working on the signage specifications, a purely administrative task, nothing technical, and he'd been stuck on the description line, the 12 words or fewer that would tell someone at the trailhead what the trail was for. He'd been sitting with 4 bad options when Emma had looked over his shoulder and read them and said, "They're all too complicated." What would you say? She'd thought about it for 2 seconds. Designed to take you all the way, she said. Because that's the point, right? That it actually goes the whole way. It doesn't stop. He'd written it down. When he'd shown it to Victoria, she'd read it and been quiet for a moment. How old is she? 8? She's right, Victoria said. Use it. The trail opened on a Saturday morning and Derek walked, the full length of it, north to south, for the first time without a clipboard or a survey tool or a contractor question to answer. Just walking it. The surface was correct under his feet. The grade changes were smooth and announced by the path itself, the way a well-designed thing announces its own intentions. The rest points were exactly where the man in the power wheelchair had pointed to, the evening of the consultation, with the expression of someone who'd spent years being failed by infrastructure. The bench at the north overlook faced the lake with the morning light on it, and Derek sat there for a while and looked at the water and the trees and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. Victoria came through in the mid-morning. He was back near the south trailhead, watching people come and go, a woman with a walker and her adult daughter taking the surface slowly, 2 teenagers on adaptive bikes, an older man who'd been at the consultation event. Derek recognized him, moving through the first section with the careful attention of someone assessing a thing they'd been told to trust but hadn't trusted yet. The man reached the first grade change and went through it and stopped on the other side and stood very still for a moment, and then he kept going. Victoria came to a stop beside Derek at the trailhead, and they watched. He was at the consultation, Derek said. I know, he emailed the foundation afterward. She watched the man disappear around the first bend. He said he'd stopped using this park 2 years ago because of the grade change. 2 years. Derek thought about 2 years of not going somewhere you wanted to go because the path told you it wasn't for you. He thought about what that accumulated into, over 2 years, in a person. What it said about you that you internalized as true. People give up on paths when paths give up on them first, he said, his own quote, back to himself. Victoria looked at him. Emma told me she wants that on a poster, she said. I know, she told me too. She emailed me about it. He looked at her. She emailed you. She has Gerald's address. She uses it. Victoria's mouth curved. The subject line was poster idea, important. He closed his eyes briefly. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. She's right about the poster. The curve became the real smile, the involuntary one, the one she'd never learned to fully manage and had stopped fully trying to. She's right about most things, actually. It's slightly alarming. Tell me about it. They stood at the trailhead in the June morning while the trail did what it was built to do, carried people through, all the way, without stopping. And the light came through the fir trees in that specific way it had in early summer in this city when the clouds were right, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the quiet between them was the kind that had been built over time and held weight and didn't need filling. He asked her, properly, on a Tuesday evening in July. Not with planning or ceremony, which was not how either of them worked, and not with the particular performance of a significant moment, which would have made them both uncomfortable. He asked her because it was a Tuesday, and they were at the long table in her study going over the design specifications for the second Hope Path site, a park in the Rainier Valley that the Parks Department had formally requested in May, and she'd made a correction to a grade calculation in the margins of his draft in the precise, non-hedging way she always made corrections, and he'd looked at the correction and then at her, and the thing he'd been carrying since sometime around the spring of the previous year had simply arrived at the moment of being said. I'd like to do this properly, he said. She looked up from the draft. Do what properly? This. He held her gaze. Us. Whatever we've been doing for a year and a half that we haven't named. She was still for a moment. The study was quiet. Gerald had gone home. Emma was at Mrs. Caldera's. The estate had the specific nighttime quiet of a large house with only 2 people in it. I know what we've been doing, she said. So do I. And you want to name it. I want to stop pretending it doesn't have a name. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her working through it. Not whether she wanted to, he didn't think it was that, but the other thing, the thing she'd told him about in the rain, the fear that existed independently of the wanting. The history of losing things, and the way that history rewrote itself onto the present and made you do preemptive damage to protect against it. He knew something about that. He knew it from the inside. I'm not going anywhere, he said, same as he'd said it in the storm, in the rain, in the East Garden. I've been here. I've been making that clear for a year and a half, and I don't know what else I can do except say it directly. You've been clear, she said. Then what am I waiting for? A pause. You're not waiting, she said. I am. I know. I'm not. She stopped. Started again. I'm not good at this. I'm aware of that. I'm not easy to be with, and I know it. I work too much and I go quiet when I should talk, and I made you wait through a winter because I was afraid of what my board would do, and that was wrong. And I've thought about it enough times to know exactly how wrong it was. You've also designed a trail system that's expanding to 4 cities, he said. You came back outside when outside was where you got hurt. You let an 8-year-old name your garden stone and send you drawings, and you wrote her back on actual paper. She looked at him. You're not easy, he said. Neither am I. I've got a kid and a city salary, and I'm finishing a degree at 32 in evening classes, and I'm still, I don't know, some days I'm still working out who I am after Claire. That doesn't go away clean. He said it plainly, because she was someone who deserved plain. But I'd rather work all of that out with you than without you. That's what I know. The room was very quiet. Then Victoria said, I'd rather do that too. And her voice was quiet and even and completely unmanaged, and it was the most honest thing she'd said to him, which was significant because she was one of the most honest people he'd met. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and her hand was cold the way it always was, and she didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a while. The design document spread between them, the study lamp making a warm circle in the July evening, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, because what had been said was enough, and there was a specific relief in that, in the thing having been said and not having destroyed anything, in the world being the same as it was before and also entirely different. The second Hope Path site broke ground in September. The third was approved for the following spring. A city in Oregon had reached out about adapting the design framework. A city in Minnesota had sent a formal inquiry. Victoria had restructured the Ashford Community Foundation's accessibility program into its own operational branch and had, in October, offered Derek the director position formally and in writing, with a salary that reflected what the work actually was rather than what his city job paid, and he'd sat with the offer letter for 1 week and then given notice at the city. Tomas shook his hand on his last day and said, "Go do the thing," which was not Tomas's usual level of eloquence, but was precise. The UW coursework was at the 14-month mark. He had 4 months left, 2 courses remaining, a structural analysis final that he was cautiously confident about, and a materials specification course that was genuinely hard and required more evenings than he'd budgeted for. Mrs. Caldera, who had been informed about the degree completion with the gravity due a significant development, had proactively offered additional evenings without being asked, and Emma had responded to this by drawing Mrs. Caldera a portrait that the older woman had framed and placed on her living room wall, which Emma reported with considerable satisfaction. Emma herself was 8 going on 9, and she had entered a phase of her development that involved strong opinions about birds, an evolving understanding of mineralogy that Rocky the Garnet Stone had initiated and that had expanded into a genuine hobby with a reference book and a small collection of specimens, and a social sophistication that continued to be slightly ahead of her actual years. She knew what was happening between her father and Victoria in the way that children know things that adults think they're being subtle about, which is to say entirely and for longer than the adults realized. She'd said something once, in August, while they were driving home from the estate on a Sunday evening, that Derek had turned over many times since. She'd been looking out the window and she'd said, with no particular lead-up, "Dad, Victoria is good for you," said not as a question and not as an observation seeking confirmation. Said as a fact being registered for the record. He'd glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Yeah?" "You laugh more," she said, "not like pretend laugh, real laugh." He hadn't had an answer for that didn't involve acknowledging that she was absolutely right. The Silver Keys were on a Saturday in November. He hadn't expected them, which was the point, or part of it. He'd come to the estate that morning not for work, there was no specific work that day, but because coming to the estate on Saturday mornings had become, over the previous year, the shape of his week's anchor point, the thing the other days oriented around. Victoria had been quiet most of the morning, not the managed quiet, the real one, which he could now distinguish from the managed version, which had taken the better part of a year to learn. The real quiet meant she was carrying something she was working out how to say. They had lunch in the morning room, Gerald's doing, simple and good. And afterward, Victoria set her cup down and looked at him with the direct, assessing look she'd turned on him that first day at the South Trailhead while he was examining her wheelchair brake. "I have something I need to say," she said. "All right, and I need you not to respond immediately. Let me finish." "Okay." She reached into the pocket of her jacket, a specific jacket, dark green, the one she wore on weekends when she wasn't performing anything for anyone, and set something on the table between them, the silver keys. He recognized them. He'd held them in the rain on Cresthaven Road and driven up the hill with them and returned them to Gerald that first day, and then been given a copy of the gate code instead. He hadn't seen these particular keys since November of the year before last. "When I handed you those on the hill," she said, "I was asking for help. That was all I knew how to do that day. Hold out something and ask someone to take it." She looked at the keys on the table. "I've thought about that a lot, about what I was actually asking for, and what I thought I was asking for, and how different those turned out to be." He didn't say anything, because he'd agreed not to yet. "I was asking for someone to take me home," she said. "That's the small version, but I think what I was actually asking for, without knowing it, was for someone to stay. Not in the moment, generally. I'd been in that estate for 14 months, and everyone who came did their job and left, and I'd told myself that was fine, that was what I needed, that I wasn't someone that I didn't need the other thing." She stopped. "I was wrong about that. The morning room was quiet. November light came through the tall windows, pale and thin. "You stayed," she said, "not because you had to, not because it was easy. You stayed through the board and the canceled contract and the storm and all the distances I put between us because I was afraid. And you stayed without making me feel like staying was something I owed you for." She looked at him. "I don't know what I did to deserve that. I've thought about it and I can't come up with an answer, but I know what I want to do with it." She pushed the keys across the table. "These aren't an emergency this time," she said. "I'm not asking you to take me home. I'm asking you to be home. Here. With Emma. With me." Her voice was steady, but it had that quality under the steadiness, the one he'd first heard in the rain in the East Garden in the August storm, the unmanaged version. "I know it's a lot. I know the estate is large, and the situation is complicated, and my board still has opinions, and none of this is simple. But I want you here. Not as a contractor, not as someone who comes on Saturdays. I want—" She stopped. "I want Emma to have a room here. I want her drawings on these walls. I want Rocky to stay in the garden permanently instead of being a thing she visits." She was looking at him directly now, not away. "And I want you. Properly. Without the distance I keep finding excuses to maintain." He looked at the keys. He thought about the first time he'd held them, cold from her pocket, rain coming down. He thought about the months between then and now, the accumulated weight of them, the concrete and the cured paths and the trail that told the truth, and the evenings over design documents and Emma's letter in the box under her bed, and the man on Hope Path who'd stopped for a moment after the grade change and then kept going. He thought about Claire, briefly and without guilt, about what it was to have loved someone and lost them, and carried that and built something else anyway, not to replace what was lost, but because that was what living required. The decision made again and again to keep building. He thought about what he'd told Emma when she'd asked if the lopsided bowl was okay. That's what makes it interesting. He picked up the keys. They were cold from her pocket again, the same as they'd always been, and they warmed in his hand the same way they had on the hill. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. "Okay?" "Okay. Yes." He held her gaze. "Emma is going to want to redesign her room entirely." Something shifted in Victoria's face. The full involuntary smile, the real one, and this time she let it stay. "I assumed. She'll have opinions about the garden too. Rocky needs a companion stone, apparently. She mentioned it in September. She told me. I've been ignoring it." "I haven't." He looked at her. "You already looked for one." Gerald found 3 options. He shook his head and the laugh came. The real one, the kind Emma had identified. "Of course he did." Victoria looked at him across the table, the keys between them, the November light sitting on everything, and her face had nothing managed in it, nothing performed, nothing protected. Just her. The person under all the versions of herself she'd had to become in order to keep functioning, which was what everyone was, finally, themselves, under everything they'd learned to wear. "I should tell you something," she said. "What?" "I was afraid this morning, before you came." She said it without apology, just registration. "I made Gerald rearrange the bookshelves because I needed something to do with it." He glanced at the bookshelves along the study wall. They looked different than usual. He hadn't been able to identify why. "How do they look?" "Worse," she said. "I'll put them back." "Leave them," he said. "It's a good reminder." She looked at the bookshelves, then back at him. "A reminder of what?" "That you're human," he said, "like the rest of us." She was quiet for a moment. "That's either reassuring or alarming." "Both," he said. "That's usually how the important things are." There are people who come into your life like weather, sudden and significant and gone. And there are people who come in like structural change. You don't notice it happening day by day, and then one morning you look at what you're standing on and it's different than it was, and stronger. And the difference was built in ordinary increments that didn't feel like construction at the time. Derek Holloway had believed for 3 years after Claire that the best he could do was maintain. Keep the existing structure sound. Don't let the damage spread. Take care of Emma. Do the work. hold the line against the particular entropy that loss introduced into a life. It was a reasonable position, and he'd held it with integrity, and it had worked, more or less, for what it was. What it was not enough. He understood that now. Not as a failure, he didn't think of it as failure, but as a phase. As the necessary thing before the next thing. The curing period, the way fresh concrete cured. You couldn't rush it, and you couldn't skip it, and you couldn't put weight on it before it was ready, but you also couldn't leave it indefinitely before it became something fixed and permanent in the wrong shape. He hadn't known he was ready until he was already in the middle of it. Victoria had been, in some ways, even more broken than he was when they met, more isolated, more defended, more committed to the proposition that the smaller life was the safer life. She'd lost the use of her legs, and she'd lost her confidence, and she'd lost 14 months to a particular kind of living death that wasn't depression, exactly, but was what happened when a person of her capability and intelligence decided that protecting herself meant stopping. She'd stopped. She'd mistaken stillness for safety and isolation for control. What Derek had given her was not a rescue. That was the story people told, the one Priya Mehta had framed carefully in the profile piece, the one that had a clean narrative shape. Maintenance worker saves woman in wheelchair, woman changes maintenance worker's life in return. Neat, symmetrical. The real version was less clean. The real version was that neither of them had saved the other. They had simply, stubbornly, continued to show up until showing up became the thing that made the other possible. He'd come back after the board and the winter. She'd come outside after the East Garden path. He'd written the design brief in the evenings while Emma slept. She'd said, "I've needed to stop to a stranger in a gymnasium without flinching." They'd built something together. Not from nothing. From their specific broken materials, from the specific things they'd each lost, and the specific things that had persisted through the losing. That was the only way anything real got built. 1 year after Derek moved into the Ashford estate, Emma's drawings were on the refrigerator in the kitchen and on the wall outside her room, which she had redesigned twice and was talking about redesigning a third time, and Rocky had a companion stone named Blue that Gerald had sourced, and that Emma had introduced to Rocky with appropriate ceremony on a Sunday afternoon while Victoria watched and Derek pretended not to be charmed. Hope Path had expanded to 7 cities. The Ashford Community Foundation's accessibility program had a staff of 6 and a waiting list of municipal partners. Derek had finished his degree in January, on a cold, clear evening that felt, in its way, like the closing of a parenthesis that had been open for 12 years. He'd texted Victoria from the parking lot afterward. Done. She'd called immediately and asked only one question. How does it feel? And he'd stood in the parking lot with his breath in the cold air and thought about it properly and said, like something that was unfinished is finished. And she'd said, good, come home. And he had. Emma had framed the degree certificate herself, a small frame she'd found in the garage, and repainted teal, because the bowl was teal and Rocky's companion stone was teal, and she had decided that teal was the family's color, which was not a decision anyone had been consulted about, but which nobody contested. The certificate hung in the study, slightly off-center because Emma had measured by eye and Derek had looked at it and thought, leave it. Imperfect things made by people who meant them. That was what made them worth keeping. Mrs. Park had stopped limping and had resumed her kitchen organization campaign and had adopted a position of warm authority toward the expanded household that felt entirely natural and probably always had been. Gerald had become somehow the kind of steadying presence in Emma's life that she didn't have words for but relied on, and he seemed to find this role, guardian of the Garnet Stones correspondence, procurer of bird books, solemn witness to rock introductions, entirely suited to him. There was a Thursday morning in the following April, a year and a half after the Keys, 2.5 years after the Hill, when Derek came through the estate's kitchen at 6:30 to find Emma already awake and at the table drawing in the specific early morning quiet before everything started. She was working on something detailed, her hand moving carefully, and she didn't look up when he came in. He made coffee and stood at the window that looked out over the East Garden. The lavender was coming up again, 3rd year running, more of it now than the original, the way lavender spread when someone tended it right. The path ran along it, level, correct, surface holding. The turning radius at the garden entrance was wide enough, the same as he'd built it. Dad, Emma said, without looking up from the drawing. Yeah. Do you think the paths we build are still there after we're gone? He considered that. It wasn't a rhetorical question. She was 8, nearly 9, and she asked the things she actually wanted to know. If they're built right, he said. Yeah. She nodded slowly, still drawing. That's good, she said. I want to build things that stay. He looked at her, the careful hand, the dark hair, the absolute seriousness of someone at the beginning of understanding what their life might be for. He thought about all the things that had brought them to this kitchen, this morning. A brake cable, a storm, a set of silver keys handed across a table in the November light, the specific stubbornness of Lavender, a child who sent drawings through the mail to people she'd decided mattered without asking anyone's permission. He thought about what it meant to build things that stayed, not perfectly. Nothing stayed perfectly. Materials degraded, surfaces wore, the world exerted its pressures continuously and without mercy. But built right, they held. Built right, they carried the weight they were meant to carry, and the people who needed them could trust them, and that trust was not a small thing. That trust was the whole point. Victoria came into the kitchen at 7, hair still down, moving through the doorway with the ease of someone in their own space, her chair leaving the small familiar sound on the tile that he'd long since stopped consciously registering. She looked at Emma. She looked at Derek. She reached across him for the coffee in the way of someone who had stopped performing movements and had started simply making them. Morning, she said. Morning, Emma said. Morning, he said. The garden was outside the window. The path ran through it. The lavender was coming up again. The coffee was hot, and the kitchen was warm, and somewhere in the estate, Gerald was doing the first things of his morning with the quiet competence that held the whole structure together. And outside the city was beginning its day, and Hope Path was in 7 cities, and going to more. And somewhere on a trail in Cascade Park, a man who hadn't been able to use his own park for 2 years was perhaps taking the North Trail all the way to the overlook and sitting on the bench and looking at the lake. Sometimes the path that saves you is built by people who needed saving too. Sometimes the thing you catch at the bottom of a hill is the beginning of everything. Sometimes the keys in your hand are cold because someone has been holding on to them for a long time, waiting to find someone worth giving them to. Derek Holloway had run toward a hill once, in the rain, because someone was falling, and that had seemed like the whole story at the time. It wasn't. It was just the first sentence. The rest was ordinary and extraordinary in the way all real things are, built slowly, imperfectly, in increments too small to call dramatic, by people who were broken in ways that turned out to be compatible with each other. The story was this kitchen, this morning, the lavender coming back.